The Thorn Birds by Colleen McCullough. Part 1. For Big Sister Jean Easthope. There is a legend about a bird which sings just once in its life, more sweetly than any other creature on the face of the earth. From the moment it leaves the nest, it searches for a thorn tree, and does not rest until it has found one. Then, singing among the savage branches, it impales itself upon the longest, sharpest spine, and dying, it rises above its own agony to out-carol the lark and the nightingale. One superlative song, existence the price. But the whole world stills to listen, and God in his heaven smiles. For the best is only bought at the cost of great pain. Or so says the legend. Section 1. 1915 to 1917. Meggie. Chapter 1. On December 8th, 1915, Meggie Cleary had her 4th birthday. After the breakfast dishes were put away, her mother silently thrust a brown paper parcel into her arms and ordered her outside. So Meggie squatted down behind the gorse bush next to the front gate and tugged impatiently. Her fingers were clumsy, the wrapping heavy. It smelled faintly of the Wahine General Store, which told her that whatever lay inside the parcel had miraculously been bought, not homemade or donated. Something fine and mistily gold began to poke through a corner. She attacked the paper faster, peeling it away in long, ragged strips. "Oh, Agnes! Oh, Agnes!" she said lovingly, blinking at the doll lying there in a tattered nest. A miracle indeed. Only once in her life had Meggie been into Wahine, all the way back in May, because she had been a very good girl. So, perched in the buggy beside her mother, on her best behavior, she had been too excited to see or remember much, except for Agnes, the beautiful doll sitting on the store counter, dressed in a crinoline of pink satin, with cream lace frills all over it. Right then and there in her mind, she had christened it Agnes, the only name she knew elegant enough for such a peerless creature. Yet over the ensuing months, her yearning after Agnes contained nothing of hope. Meggie didn't own a doll, and had no idea little girls and dolls belonged together. She played happily with the whistles and slingshots and battered soldiers her brothers discarded, got her hands dirty and her boots muddy. It never occurred to her that Agnes was to play with. Stroking the bright pink folds of the dress, grander than any she had ever seen on a human woman, she picked Agnes up tenderly. The doll had jointed arms and legs which could be moved anywhere. Even her neck and tiny, shapely waist were jointed. Her golden hair was exquisitely dressed, in a high pompadour studded with pearls. Her pale bosom peeped out of a foaming fichu of cream lace, fastened with a pearl pin. The finely painted bone china face was beautiful, left unglazed, to give the delicately tinted skin a natural matte texture. Astonishingly lifelike blue eyes shone between lashes of real hair, their irises streaked and circled with a darker blue. Fascinated, Meggie discovered that when Agnes lay back far enough, her eyes closed. High on one faintly flushed cheek, she had a black beauty mark, and her dusky mouth was parted slightly to show tiny white teeth. Meggie put the doll gently on her lap, crossed her feet under her comfortably, and sat just looking. She was still sitting behind the gorse bush when Jack and Hughie came rustling through the grass where it was too close to the fence to feel a scythe. Her hair was the typical Cleary beacon, all the Cleary children save Frank being martyred by a thatch some shade of red. Jack nudged his brother and pointed gleefully. They separated, grinning at each other, and pretended they were troopers after a Maori renegade. Meggie would not have heard them anyway, so engrossed was she in Agnes, humming softly to herself. "What's that you've got, Meggie?" Jack shouted, pouncing. "Show us." "Yes, show us," Hughie giggled, outflanking her. She clasped the doll against her chest and shook her head. "No, she's mine. I got her for my birthday." "Show us. Go on. We just want to have a look." Pride and joy won out. She held the doll so her brothers could see. "Look, Isn't she beautiful? Her name is Agnes." "Agnes? Agnes?" Jack gagged realistically. "What a soppy name. Why don't you call her Margaret, or Betty?" "Because she's Agnes." Hughie noticed the joint in the doll's wrist and whistled. "Hey, Jack, look, it can move its hand." "Where? Let's see." "No." Maggie hugged the doll close again, tears forming. "No, you'll break her. Oh, Jack, don't take her away. You'll break her." "Pooh." His dirty brown hands locked about her wrists, closing tightly. "Want a Chinese bun? And don't be such a crybaby, or I'll tell Bob." He squeezed her skin in opposite directions until it stretched whitely as Hughie got hold of the doll's skirts and pulled. "Gimme, or I'll do it really hard." "No, don't, Jack. Please don't. You'll break her. I know you will. Oh, please, leave her alone. Don't take her, please." In spite of the cruel grip on her wrists, she clung to the doll, sobbing and kicking. "Got it!" Hughie whooped as the doll slid under Maggie's crossed forearms. Jack and Hughie found her just as fascinating as Maggie had. Off came the dress, the petticoats, and long frilly drawers. Agnes lay naked while the boys pushed and pulled at her, forcing one foot round the back of her head, making her look down her spine, every possible contortion they could think of. They took no notice of Maggie as she stood crying. It did not occur to her to seek help, for in the Cleary family those who could not fight their own battles got scant aid or sympathy, and that went for girls too. The doll's golden hair tumbled down, the pearls flew winking into the long grass and disappeared. A dusty boot came down thoughtlessly on the abandoned dress, smearing grease from the smithy across its satin. Maggie dropped to her knees, scrabbling frantically to collect the miniature clothes before more damage was done them. Then she began picking among the grass blades where she thought the pearls might have fallen. Her tears were blinding her. The grief in her heart knew, for until now she had never owned anything worth grieving for. Frank threw the shoe hissing into cold water and straightened his back. It didn't ache these days, so perhaps he was used to smithying. Not before time, his father would have said, after 6 months at it. But Frank knew very well how long it was since his introduction to the forge and anvil. He had measured the time in hatred and resentment. Throwing the hammer into its box, he pushed the lank black hair off his brow with a trembling hand and dragged the old leather apron from around his neck. His shirt lay on a heap of straw in the corner. He plodded across it and stood for a moment, staring at the splintering barn wall as if it did not exist, his black eyes wide and fixed. He was very small, not above 5 feet 3 inches, and thin still as striplings are, but the bare shoulders and arms had muscles already knotted from working with the hammer, and the pale, flawless skin gleamed with sweat. The darkness of his hair and eyes had a foreign tang, his full-lipped mouth and wide-bridged nose, not the usual family shape. But there was Maori blood on his mother's side, and in him it showed. He was nearly 16 years old, where Bob was barely 11, Jack 10, Hughie 9, Stuart 5, and little Maggie 3. Then he remembered that today Maggie was 4. It was December 8th. He put on his shirt and left the barn. The house lay on top of a small hill about 100 feet higher than the barn and stables. Like all New Zealand houses, it was wooden, rambling over many squares, and of 1 story only, on the theory that if an earthquake struck, some of it might be left standing. Around it gorse grew everywhere, at the moment smothered in rich yellow flowers. The grass was green and luxuriant, like all New Zealand grass. Not even in the middle of winter, when the frost sometimes lay unmelted all day in the shade, did the grass turn brown, and the long, mild summer only tinted it an even richer green. The rains fell gently without bruising the tender sweetness of all growing things. There was no snow, and the sun had just enough strength to cherish, never enough to sap. New Zealand scourges thundered up out of the bowels of the earth rather than descended from the skies. There was always a suffocated sense of waiting, an intangible shuddering and thumping that actually transmitted itself through the feet. For beneath the ground lay awesome power. Power of such magnitude that 30 years before, a whole towering mountain had disappeared. Steam gushed howling out of cracks in the sides of innocent hills. Volcanoes spumed smoke into the sky, and the alpine streams ran warm. Huge lakes of mud boiled oilily. The seas lapped uncertainly at cliffs which might not be there to greet the next incoming tide, and in places the earth's crust was only 900 feet thick. Yet it was a gentle, gracious land. Beyond the house stretched an undulating plain as green as the emerald in Fiona Cleary's engagement ring. Dotted with thousands of creamy bundles, close proximity revealed as sheep. Where the curving hills scalloped the edge of the light blue sky, Mount Egmont soared 10,000 feet, sloping into the clouds, its sides still white with snow, its symmetry so perfect that even those like Frank who saw it every day of their lives never ceased to marvel. It was quite a pull from the barn to the house, but Frank hurried because he knew he ought not to be going. His father's orders were explicit. Then, as he rounded the corner of the house, he saw the little group by the gorse bush. Frank had driven his mother into Wahine to buy Maggie's doll, and he was still wondering what had prompted her to do it. She wasn't given to impractical birthday presents. There wasn't the money for them, and she had never given a toy to anyone before. They all got clothes. Birthdays and Christmases replenished sparse wardrobes. But apparently Maggie had seen the doll on her one and only trip into town, and Fiona had not forgotten. When Frank questioned her, she muttered something about a girl needing a doll, and quickly changed the subject. Jack and Hughie had the doll between them on the front path, manipulating its joints callously. All Frank could see of Maggie was her back, as she stood watching her brothers desecrate Agnes. Her neat white socks had slipped in crinkled folds around her little black boots, and the pink of her legs was visible for 3 or 4 inches below the hem of her brown velvet Sunday dress. Down her back cascaded a mane of carefully curled hair, sparkling in the sun, not red and not gold, but somewhere in between. The white taffeta bow, which held the front curls back from her face, hung draggled and limp. Dust smeared her dress. She held the doll's clothes tightly in one hand, the other pushing vainly at Hughie. "You bloody little bastards!" Jack and Hughie scrambled to their feet and ran, the doll forgotten. When Frank swore, it was politic to run. "If I catch you flaming little twerps touching that doll again, I'll brand your shitty little arses!" Frank yelled after them. He bent down and took Maggie's shoulders between his hands, shaking her gently. "Here, here, there's no need to cry. Come on now. They've gone, and they'll never touch your dolly again, I promise. Give me a smile for your birthday, eh?" Her face was swollen, her eyes running. She stared at Frank out of gray eyes so large and full of tragedy that he felt his throat tighten. Pulling a dirty rag from his breeches pocket, he rubbed it clumsily over her face, then pinched her nose between its folds. "Blow." She did as she was told, hiccuping noisily as her tears dried. "Oh, Frank, they took Agnes away from me," she sniffled. Her hair all fall down, and she lost all the pretty widow pearls in it. They all fall in the grass, and I can't find them." The tears welled up again, splashing on Frank's hand. He stared at his wet skin for a moment, then licked the drops off. "Well, we'll have to find them, won't we? But you can't find anything while you're crying, you know. And what's all this baby talk? I haven't heard you say whittle instead of little for 6 months. Here, blow your nose again, and then pick up poor Agnes. If you don't put her clothes on, she'll get sunburned." He made her sit on the edge of the path and gave her the doll gently. Then he crawled about searching the grass until he gave a triumphant whoop and held up a pearl. "There, first one. We'll find them all. You wait and see." Maggie watched her oldest brother adoringly while he picked among the grass blades, holding up each pearl as he found it. Then she remembered how delicate Agnes's skin must be, how easily it must burn, and bent her attention on clothing the doll. There did not seem any real injury. Her hair was tangled and loose, her arms and legs dirty where the boys had pushed and pulled at them, but everything still worked. A tortoise-shell comb nestled above each of Maggie's ears. She tugged at one until it came free, and began to comb Agnes's hair, which was genuine human hair, skillfully knotted onto a base of glue and gauze, and bleached until it was the color of gilded straw. She was yanking inexpertly at a large knot when the dreadful thing happened. Off came the hair, all of it, dangling in a tousled clump from the teeth of the comb. Above Agnes's smooth, broad brow there was nothing. No head, no bald skull. Just an awful, yawning hole. Shivering in terror, Meggie leaned forward to peer inside the doll's cranium. The inverted contours of cheeks and chin showed dimly. Light glittered between the parted lips with their teeth a black animal silhouette. And above all this were Agnes's eyes, two horrible clicking balls speared by a wire rod that cruelly pierced her head. Maggie's scream was high and thin, unchildlike. She flung Agnes away and went on screaming, hands covering her face, shaking and shuddering. Then she felt Frank pull at her fingers and take her into his arms, pushing her face into the side of his neck. Wrapping her arms about him, she took comfort from him until his nearness calmed her enough to become aware of how nice he smelled, all horses and sweat and iron. When she quietened, Frank made her tell him what was the matter. He picked up the doll and stared into its empty head in wonder, trying to remember if his infant universe had been so beset by strange terrors. But his unpleasant phantoms were of people and whispers and cold glances, of his mother's face pinched and shrinking, her hand trembling as it held his, the set of her shoulders. What had Meggie seen to make her take on so? He fancied she would not have been nearly so upset if poor Agnes had only bled when she lost her hair. Bleeding was a fact. Someone in the Cleary family bled copiously at least once a week. "Her eyes, Meggie whispered, refusing to look at the doll. "She's a bloody marvel, Meggie," he murmured, his face nuzzling into her hair. How fine it was, how rich and full of color. It took him half an hour of cajoling to make her look at Agnes, and half an hour more elapsed before he could persuade her to peer into the scalped hole. He showed her how the eyes worked, how very carefully they had been aligned to fit snugly yet swing easily opened or closed. "Come on now, it's time you went inside," he told her, swinging her up into his arms and tucking the doll between his chest and hers. "We'll get Mum to fix her up, eh? We'll wash and iron her clothes and glue on her hair again. I'll make you some proper hairpins out of those pearls, too, so they can't fall out, and you can do her hair in all sorts of ways." Fiona Cleary was in the kitchen peeling potatoes. She was a very handsome, very fair woman, a little under medium height, but rather hard-faced and stern. She had an excellent figure with a tiny waist, which had not thickened in spite of the 6 babies she had carried beneath it. Her dress was grey calico, its skirts brushing the spotless floor, its front protected by an enormous starched apron that looped around her neck and tied in the small of her spine with a crisp, perfect bow. From waking to sleeping, she lived in the kitchen and backyard, her stout black boots beating a circular path from stove to laundry to vegetable patch to clothesline and thence to the stove again. She put her knife on the table and stared at Frank and Meggie, the corners of her beautiful mouth turning down. "Meggie, I let you put on your Sunday best dress this morning on one condition, that you didn't get it dirty. And look at you. What a little grub you are." "Mum, it wasn't her fault," Frank protested. "Jack and Hughie took a doll away to try and find out how the arms and legs worked. I promised we'd fix it up as good as new. We can, can't we?" "Let me see." Fee held out her hand for the doll. She was a silent woman, not given to spontaneous conversation. What she thought no one ever knew, even her husband. She left the disciplining of the children to him, and did whatever he commanded without comment or complaint, unless the circumstances were most unusual. Meggie had heard the boys whispering that she stood in as much awe of Daddy as they did, but if that was true she hid it under a veneer of impenetrable, slightly dour calm. She never laughed, nor did she ever lose her temper. Finished her inspection, Fee laid Agnes on the dresser near the stove and looked at Meggie. "I'll wash her clothes tomorrow night and do her hair again. Frank can glue the hair on after tea tonight, I suppose, and give her a bath." The words were matter-of-fact rather than comforting. Meggie nodded, smiling uncertainly. Sometimes she wanted so badly to hear her mother laugh, but her mother never did. She sensed that they shared a special something not common to Daddy and the boys, but there was no reaching beyond that rigid back, those never-still feet. Mum would nod absently and flip her voluminous skirts expertly from stove to table as she continued working. What none of the children save Frank could realize was that Fee was permanently, incurably tired. There was so much to be done, hardly any money to do it with, not enough time, and only one pair of hands. She longed for the day when Meggie would be old enough to help. Already the child did simple tasks, but at barely 4 years of age it couldn't possibly lighten the load. 6 children, and only one of them, the youngest at that, a girl. All her acquaintances were simultaneously sympathetic and envious, but that didn't get the work done. Her sewing basket had a mountain of socks in it still undarned, her knitting needles held yet another sock, and there was Hughie growing out of his sweaters and Jack not ready to hand his down. Paddy Cleary was to home the week of Meggie's birthday, purely by chance. It was too early for the shearing season, and he had work locally, ploughing and planting. By profession he was a shearer of sheep, a seasonal occupation which lasted from the middle of summer to the end of winter, after which came lambing. Usually he managed to find plenty of work to tide him over spring and the first month of summer, helping with lambing, ploughing, or spelling a local dairy farmer from his endless twice-a-day milking. When there was work he went, leaving his family in the big old house to fend for themselves. Not as harsh an action as it seemed. Unless one was lucky enough to own land, that was what one had to do. When he came in a little after sunset, the lamps were lit, and shadows played flickering games around the high ceiling. The boys were clustered on the back veranda playing with a frog, except for Frank. Paddy knew where he was, because he could hear the steady clocking of an axe from the direction of the wood heap. He paused on the veranda, only long enough to plant a kick on Jack's backside and clip Bob's ear. "Go and help Frank with the wood, you lazy little scamps, and it had better be done before Mum has tea on the table, or there'll be skin and hair flying." He nodded to Fiona, busy at the stove. He did not kiss or embrace her, for he regarded displays of affection between husband and wife as something suitable only for the bedroom. As he used the jack to haul off his mud-caked boots, Meggie came skipping with his slippers, and he grinned down at the little girl with the curious sense of wonder he always knew at sight of her. She was so pretty, such beautiful hair. He picked up a curl and pulled it out straight, then let it go, just to see it jiggle and bounce as it settled back into place. Picking the child up, he went to sit in the only comfortable chair the kitchen possessed, a Windsor chair with a cushion tied to its seat, drawn close to the fire. Sighing softly, he sat down in it and pulled out his pipe, carelessly tapping out the spent dottle of tobacco in its bowl onto the floor. Meggie cuddled down on his lap and wound her arms about his neck, her cool little face turned up to his as she played her nightly game of watching the light filter through his short stubble of golden beard. "How are you, Fee?" Paddy Cleary asked his wife. "All right, Paddy. Did you get the lower paddock done today?" "Yes, all done. I can start on the upper first thing in the morning. Lord, but I'm tired." "I'll bet. Did Macpherson give you the crotchety old mare again?" "Too right. You don't think he'd take the animal himself to let me have the roan, do you? My arms feel as if they'd been pulled out of their sockets. I swear that mare has the hardest mouth in NZ. "Never mind. Old Robertson's horses are all good, and you'll be there soon enough." "Can't be soon enough." He packed his pipe with coarse tobacco and pulled a taper from the big jar that stood near the stove. A quick flick inside the firebox door and it caught. He leaned back in his chair and sucked so deeply the pipe made bubbling noises. "How's it feel to be 4, Meggie?" he asked his daughter.
"Pretty good, Daddy."
"Did Mum give you your present?"
"Oh, Daddy, how did you and Mum guess I wanted Agnes?"
"Agnes?" He looked swiftly toward Fee, smiling and quizzing her with his eyebrows. "Is that her name, Agnes?"
"Yes, she's beautiful, Daddy. I want to look at her all day."
"She's lucky to have anything to look at," Fee said grimly. "Jack and Hughie got hold of the doll before poor Meggie had a chance to see it properly." "Well, boys will be boys. Is the damage bad?" "Nothing that can't be mended. Frank caught them before it went too far." "Frank? What was he doing down here? He was supposed to be at the forge all day. Hunter wants his gates.
He was at the forge all day. He just came down for a tool of some sort, Fee answered quickly.
Patrick was too hard on Frank.
Oh, Daddy, Frank is the best brother. He saved my Agnes from being killed, and he's going to glue her hair on again for me after tea.
That's good, her father said drowsily, leaning his head back in the chair and closing his eyes. It was hot in front of the stove, but he didn't seem to notice. Beads of sweat gathered on his forehead, glistening. He put his arms behind his head and fell into a doze. It was from Paddy Cleary that his children got their various shades of thick, waving red hair, though none had inherited quite such an aggressively red head as his. He was a small man, all steel and springs in build, legs bowed from a lifetime among horses, arms elongated from years shearing sheep. His chest and arms were covered in a matted golden fuzz, which would have been ugly had he been dark. His eyes were bright blue, crinkled up into a permanent squint like a sailor's, from gazing into the far distance, and his face was a pleasant one, with a whimsical smiling quality about it that made other men like him at a glance. His nose was magnificent, a true Roman nose, which must have puzzled his Irish confrères, but Ireland has ever been a shipwreck coast. He still spoke with the soft, quick slur of the Galway Irish, pronouncing his final T's as TH's, but almost 20 years in the Antipodes had forced a quaint overlay upon it, so that his A's came out as I's, and the speed of his speech had run down a little, like an old clock in need of a good winding. A happy man, he had managed to weather his hard and drudging existence better than most, and though he was a rigid disciplinarian with a heavy swing to his boot, all but one of his children adored him. If there was not enough bread to go around, he went without. If it was a choice between new clothes for him or new clothes for one of his offspring, he went without. In its way, that was more reliable evidence of love than a million easy kisses. His temper was very fiery, and he had killed a man once. Luck had been with him. The man was English, and there was a ship in Dunleary harbour bound for New Zealand on the tide. Fiona went to the back door and shouted, "Tay!" The boys trailed in gradually, Frank bringing up the rear with an armload of wood, which he dumped in the big box beside the stove. Patrick put Meggie down and walked to the head of the non-company dining table at the far end of the kitchen, while the boys seated themselves around its sides, and Meggie scrambled up on top of the wooden box her father put on the chair nearest to him. Fee served the food directly onto dinner plates at her work table more quickly and efficiently than a waiter. She carried them 2 at a time to her family, Paddy first, then Frank, and so on down to Meggie, with herself last. "Urkel stew," said Stuart, pulling faces as he picked up his knife and fork. "Why do you have to name me after stew?" "Eat it," his father growled. The plates were big ones. They were literally heaped with food. Boiled potatoes, lamb stew, and beans cut that day from the garden, ladled in huge portions. In spite of the muted groans and sounds of disgust, everyone, including Stu, polished his plate clean with bread, and ate several slices more, spread thickly with butter and native gooseberry jam. Fee sat down and bolted her meal, then got up at once to hurry to her work table again, where into big soup plates she doled out great quantities of biscuit, made with plenty of sugar, and laced all through with jam. A river of steaming hot custard sauce was poured over each, and again she plodded to the dining table with the plates, 2 at a time. Finally she sat down with a sigh. This she could eat at her leisure.
"Oh, goody! Jam roly-poly!" Meggie exclaimed, slopping her spoon up and down in the custard until the jam seeped through to make pink streaks in the yellow. "Well, Meggie girl, it's your birthday, so Mum made your favourite pudding," her father said, smiling. There were no complaints this time. No matter what the pudding was, it was consumed with gusto. The Clearys all had a sweet tooth. No one carried a pound of superfluous flesh, in spite of the vast quantities of starchy food. They expended every ounce they ate in work or play. Vegetables and fruit were eaten because they were good for you, but it was the bread, potatoes, meat, and hot floury puddings which staved off exhaustion. After Fee had poured everyone a cup of tea from her giant pot, they stayed talking, drinking, or reading for an hour or more, Paddy puffing on his pipe with his head in a library book, Fee continuously refilling cups, Bob immersed in another library book, while the younger children made plans for the morrow. School had dispersed for the long summer vacation.
The boys were on the loose and eager to commence their allotted chores around the house and garden. Bob had to touch up the exterior paintwork where it was necessary. Jack and Hughie dealt with the wood heap, outbuilding, and milking. Stuart tended the vegetables. Play compared to the horrors of school. From time to time, Paddy lifted his head from his book to add another job to the list, but Fee said nothing, and Frank slumped tiredly, sipping cup after cup of tea. Finally, Fee beckoned Meggie to sit on a high stool and did up her hair in its nightly rags before packing her off to bed with Stu and Hughie. Jack and Bob begged to be excused and went outside to feed the dogs. Frank took Meggie's doll to the work table and began to glue its hair on again. Stretching, Patrick closed his book and put his pipe into the huge iridescent poa shell, which served him as an ashtray. "Well, Mother, I'm off to bed." "Good night, Paddy." Fee cleared the dishes off the dining table and got a big galvanized iron tub down from its hook on the wall. She put it at the opposite end of the work table from Frank, and lifting the massive cast-iron kettle off the stove, filled it with hot water. Cold water from an old kerosene tin served to cool the steaming bath. Swishing soap confined in a wire basket through it, she began to wash and rinse the dishes, stacking them against a cup. Frank worked on the doll without raising his head, but as the pile of plates grew, he got up silently to fetch a towel and began to dry them. Moving between the work table and the dresser, he worked with the ease of long familiarity. It was a furtive, fearful game he and his mother played, for the most stringent rule in Paddy's domain concerned the proper delegation of duties. The house was woman's work, and that was that. No male member of the family was to put his hand to a female task. But each night after Paddy went to bed, Frank helped his mother, Fee aiding and abetting him by delaying her dishwashing until they heard the thump of Paddy's slippers hitting the floor. Once Paddy's slippers were off, he never came back to the kitchen. Fee looked at Frank gently. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Frank, but you shouldn't. You'll be so tired in the morning." "It's all right, Mum. Drying a few dishes won't kill me. Little enough to make life easier for you." "It's my job, Frank. I don't mind." "I just wish we'd get rich one of these days so you could have a maid." "That is wishful thinking." She wiped her soapy red hands on the dishcloth and then pressed them into her sides, sighing. Her eyes, as they rested on her son, were vaguely worried, sensing his bitter discontent, more than the normal railing of a working man against his lot. "Frank, don't get ideas. They only lead to trouble. We're working-class people, which means we don't get rich or have maids. Be content with what you are and what you have. When you say things like this, you're insulting Daddy, and he doesn't deserve it. You know that. He doesn't drink, he doesn't gamble, and he works awfully hard for us. Not a penny he earns goes into his own pocket. It all comes to us." The muscular shoulders hunched impatiently. The dark face became harsh and grim. "But why should wanting more out of life than drudgery be so bad? I don't see what's wrong with wishing you had a maid." "It's wrong because it can't be. You know there's no money to keep you at school, and if you can't stay at school, how are you ever going to be anything better than a manual worker? Your accent, your clothes, and your hands show that you labor for a living. But it's no disgrace to have calluses on your hands. As Daddy says, when a man's hands are calloused, you know he's honest." Frank shrugged and said no more. The dishes were all put away. Fee got out her sewing basket and sat down in Paddy's chair by the fire, while Frank went back to the doll. "Poor little Meggie," he said suddenly. "Why?" "Today, when those wretched chaps were pulling her dolly about, she just stood there crying as if her whole world had fallen to bits." He looked down at the doll, which was wearing its hair again. "Agnes! Where on earth did she get a name like that?" "She must have heard me talking about Agnes Fortescue Smythe, I suppose." When I gave her the doll back, she looked into its head and nearly died of fright. Something scared her about its eyes. I don't know what. "Maggie's always seeing things that aren't there." "It's a pity there isn't enough money to keep the little children at school. They're so clever." "Oh, Frank, if wishes were horses, beggars might ride," his mother said wearily. She passed her hand across her eyes, trembling a little, and stuck her darning needle deep into a ball of grey wool. "I can't do any more. I'm too tired to see straight." "Go to bed, Mum. I'll blow out the lamps." "As soon as I've stoked the fire."
I'll do that." He got up from the table and put the dainty china doll carefully down behind a cake tin on the dresser, where it would be out of harm's way. He was not worried that the boys might attempt further rapine. They were more frightened of his vengeance than of their father's, for Frank had a vicious streak. When he was with his mother or his sister it never appeared, but the boys had all suffered from it. Fee watched him, her heart aching. There was something wild and desperate about Frank, an aura of trouble. If only he and Paddy got on better together. But they could never see eye to eye and argued constantly. Maybe he was too concerned for her. Maybe he was a bit of a mother's boy. Her fault if it was true. Yet it spoke of his loving heart, his goodness. He only wanted to make her life a little easier. And again she found herself yearning for the day when Meggie became old enough to take the burden of it from Frank's shoulders. She picked up a small lamp from the table, then put it down again, and walked across to where Frank was squatted before the stove, packing wood into the big firebox and fiddling with the damper. His white arm was roped with prominent veins, his finely made hands too stained ever to come clean. Her own hand went out timidly, and very lightly smoothed the straight black hair out of his eyes. It was as close as she could bring herself to a caress. "Good night, Frank. And thank you." The shadows wheeled and darted before the advancing light as Fee moved silently through the door leading into the front part of the house. Frank and Bob shared the first bedroom. She pushed its door open noiselessly and held the lamp high, its light flooding the double bed in the corner. Bob was lying on his back with his mouth sagging open, quivering and twitching like a dog. She crossed to the bed and rolled him over onto his right side before he could pass into a full-fledged nightmare, then stayed looking down at him for a moment. How like Paddy he was. Jack and Hughie were almost braided together in the next room. What dreadful scamps they were, never out of mischief, but no malice in them. She tried vainly to separate them and restore some sort of order to their bedclothes, but the two curly red heads refused to be parted. Softly sighing, she gave up. How they managed to be refreshed after the kind of night they passed was beyond her, but they seemed to thrive on it. The room where Meggie and Stuart slept was a dingy and cheerless place for two small children. Painted a stuffy brown and floored in brown linoleum, no pictures on the walls, just like the other bedrooms. Stuart had turned himself upside down and was quite invisible except for his little night-shirted bottom sticking out of the covers where his head ought to have been. Fee found his head touching his knees, and as usual marveled that he had not suffocated. She slid her hand gingerly across the sheet and stiffened. Wet again. Well, it would have to wait until the morning, when no doubt the pillow would be wet too. He always did that, reversed himself, and then wet once more. Well, one bedwetter among 5 boys wasn't bad. Meggie was curled into a little heap with her thumb in her mouth and her rag-decorated hair all around her. The only girl. Fee cast her no more than a passing glance before leaving. There was no mystery to Meggie. She was female. Fee knew what her lot would be and did not envy her or pity her. The boys were different. They were miracles, males alchemized out of her female body. It was hard not having help around the house, but it was worth it. Among his peers, Paddy's sons were the greatest character reference he possessed. Let a man breed sons, and he was a real man. She closed the door to her own bedroom softly and put the lamp down on a bureau. Her nimble fingers flew down the dozens of tiny buttons between the high collar and the hips of her dress, then peeled it away from her arms. She slipped the camisole off her arms also, and holding it very carefully against her chest, she wriggled into a long flannel nightgown. Only then, decently covered, did she divest herself of camisole, drawers, and loosely laced stays. Down came the tightly knotted golden hair, all its pins put into a power shell on the bureau. But even this, beautiful as it was, thick and shining and very straight, was not permitted freedom. Fee got her elbows up over her head and her hands behind her neck, and began to braid it swiftly. She turned then toward the bed, her breathing unconsciously suspended. But Paddy was asleep, so she heaved a gusty sigh of relief. Not that it wasn't nice when Paddy was in the mood, for he was a shy, tender, considerate lover.
But until Meggie was 2 or 3 years older, it would be very hard to have more babies. Chapter 2. When the Clearys went to church on Sundays, Meggie had to stay home with one of the older boys, longing for the day when she, too, would be old enough to go. Paddy Cleary held that small children had no place in any house save their own, and his rule held even for a house of worship. When Meggie commenced school and could be trusted to sit still, she could come to church, not before. So every Sunday morning she stood by the gorse bush at the front gate, desolate while the family piled into the old shandrydan, and the brother delegated to mind her tried to pretend it was a great treat, escaping Mass. The only Cleary who relished separation from the rest was Frank. Paddy's religion was an intrinsic part of his life. When he had married Fee, it had been with grudging Catholic approval, for Fee was a member of the Church of England. Though she abandoned her faith for Paddy, she refused to adopt his in its stead. Difficult to say why, except that the Armstrongs were old pioneering stock of impeccable Church of England extraction, where Paddy was a penniless immigrant from the wrong side of the pale. There had been Armstrongs in New Zealand long before the first official settlers arrived, and that was a passport to colonial aristocracy. From the Armstrong point of view, Fee could only be said to have contracted a shocking mésalliance. Roderick Armstrong had founded the New Zealand clan in a very curious way. It had begun with an event which was to have many unforeseen repercussions on 18th century England, the American War of Independence. Until 1776, over 1,000 British petty felons were shipped each year to Virginia and the Carolinas, sold into an indentured servitude no better than slavery. British justice of the time was grim and unflinching. Murder, arson, the mysterious crime of impersonating Egyptians, and larceny to the tune of more than a shilling were punished on the gallows. Petty crime meant transportation to the Americas for the term of the felon's natural life. But when in 1776 the Americas were closed, England found herself with a rapidly increasing convict population and nowhere to put it. The prisons filled to overflowing, and the surplus was jammed into rotting hulks moored in the river estuaries. Something had to be done, so something was. With a great deal of reluctance, because it meant the expenditure of a few £1,000s, Captain Arthur Phillip was ordered to set sail for the Great South Land. The year was 1787. His fleet of 11 ships held over 1,000 convicts, plus sailors, naval officers, and a contingent of marines. No glorious odyssey in search of freedom, this. At the end of January 1788, 8 months after setting sail from England, the fleet arrived in Botany Bay. His Mad Majesty George III had found a new dumping ground for his convicts, the colony of New South Wales. In 1801, when he was just 20 years of age, Roderick Armstrong was sentenced to transportation for the term of his natural life. Later generations of Armstrongs insisted he came of Somerset gentlefolk who had lost their fortune following the American Revolution, and that his crime was non-existent, but none of them had ever tried hard to trace their illustrious ancestors' background. They just basked in his reflected glory and improvised somewhat. Whatever his origins and status in English life, the young Roderick Armstrong was a Tartar. All through the unspeakable 8 months' voyage to New South Wales, he proved a stubborn, difficult prisoner, further endearing himself to his ship's officers by refusing to die. When he arrived in Sydney in 1803, his behavior worsened. So he was shipped to Norfolk Island and the prison for intractables. Nothing improved his conduct. They starved him. They immured him in a cell so small he could neither sit, stand, nor lie. They flogged him to jellied pulp. They chained him to a rock in the sea and let him half drown. And he laughed at them, a skinny collection of bones in filthy canvas, not a tooth in his mouth or an inch of his skin unscarred, lit from within by a fire of bitterness and defiance nothing seemed to quench. At the beginning of each day he willed himself not to die, and at the end of each day he laughed in triumph to find himself still alive. In 1810 he was sent to Van Diemen's Land, put in a chain gang, and set to hew a road through the iron-hard sandstone country behind Hobart. At first opportunity, he had used his pick to hack a hole in the chest of the trooper commanding the expedition. He and 10 other convicts massacred 5 more troopers by shaving the flesh from their bones an inch at a time until they died screaming in agony. For they and their guards were beasts, elemental creatures whose emotions had atrophied to the subhuman. Roderick Armstrong could no more have gone off into his escape, leaving his tormentors intact or quickly dead, than he could have reconciled himself to being a convict. With the rum and bread and jerky they took from the troopers, the 11 men fought their way through miles of freezing rainforest and came out at the whaling station of Hobart, where they stole a longboat and set off across the Tasman Sea, without food, water, or sails. When the longboat washed ashore on the wild west coast of New Zealand's South Island, Roderick Armstrong and 2 other men were still alive. He never spoke of that incredible journey, but it was whispered that the 3 had survived by killing and eating their weaker companions. That was just 9 years after he had been transported from England. He was yet a young man, but he looked 60. By the time the first officially sanctioned settlers arrived in New Zealand in 1840, he had hewn lands for himself in the rich Canterbury district of the South Island, married a Maori woman, and sired a brood of 13 handsome half-Polynesian children. And by 1860, the Armstrongs were colonial aristocrats, sent their male offspring to exclusive schools back in England, and amply proved by their cunning and acquisitiveness that they were indeed true descendants of a remarkable, formidable man. Roderick's grandson James had fathered Fiona in 1880, the only daughter among a total of 15 children. If Fee missed the more austere Protestant rites of her childhood, she never said so. She tolerated Paddy's religious convictions and attended Mass with him, saw to it that her children worshipped an exclusively Catholic God. But because she had never converted, the little touches were missing, like grace before meals and prayers before bed, and everyday holiness. Aside from that one trip into Wahine, 18 months before, Meggie had never been farther from home than the barn and smithy in the hollow. On the morning of her first day at school, she was so excited she vomited her breakfast and had to be bundled back into her bedroom to be washed and changed. Off came the lovely new costume of navy blue with a big white sailor collar. On went her horrid brown wincey, which buttoned high around her little neck and always felt as if it were choking her. "And for heaven's sake, Meggie, next time you feel sick, tell me. Don't just sit there until it's too late and I've got a mess to clean up as well as everything else. Now you're going to have to hurry because if you're late for the bell, Sister Agatha is sure to cane you. Behave yourself and mind your brothers." Bob, Jack, Hughie, and Stu were hopping up and down by the front gate when Fee finally pushed Meggie out the door, her luncheon jam sandwiches in an old satchel. "Come on, Meggie, we'll be late," Bob shouted, moving off down the road. Meggie followed the dwindling forms of her brothers at a run. It was a little after 7 o'clock in the morning, and the gentle sun had been up several hours. The dew had dried off the grass, except where there was deep shade. The Wahine road was a wheel-rutted earthen track, 2 ribbons of dark red separated by a wide band of bright green grass. White calla lilies and orange nasturtiums flowered profusely in the high grass to either side, where the neat wooden fences of bordering properties warned against trespassing. Bob always walked to school along the top of the right-hand fences, balancing his leather satchel on his head instead of wearing it haversack style. The left-hand fence belonged to Jack, which permitted the 3 younger Clearys domain of the road itself. At the top of the long, steep hill they had to climb from the Smithy Hollow to where the Robertson Road joined the Wahine Road, they paused for a moment, panting, the 5 bright heads haloed against a puffily clouded sky. This was the best part, going down the hill. They linked hands and galloped on the grassy verge until it vanished in a tangle of flowers, wishing they had the time to sneak under Mr. Chapman's fence and roll all the way down like boulders. It was 5 miles from the Cleary house to Wahine, and by the time Meggie saw telegraph poles in the distance, her legs were trembling and her socks were falling down. Ears tuned for the assembly bell, Bob glanced at her impatiently as she toiled along, hitching at her drawers and giving an occasional gasp of distress. Her face under the mass of hair was pink and yet curiously pallid. Sighing, Bob passed his satchel to Jack and ran his hands down the sides of his knickers. "Come on, Meggie, I'll piggyback you the rest of the way," he said, gruffly, glaring at his brothers in case they had the mistaken idea that he was going soft. Meggie scrambled onto his back, heaved herself up enough to lock her legs around his waist, and pillowed her head on his skinny shoulder blissfully.
Now she could view Wahine in comfort. There was not much to see. Little more than a big village, Wahine straggled down each side of a tar-centered road. The biggest building was the local hotel of 2 stories, with an awning shading the footpath from the sun and posts supporting the awning all along the gutter. The general store was the next biggest building, also boasting a sheltering awning and 2 long wooden benches under its cluttered windows for passers-by to rest upon. There was a flagpole in front of the Masonic Hall. From its top a tattered Union Jack fluttered, faded in the stiff breeze. As yet the town possessed no garage, horseless carriages being limited to a very few, but there was a blacksmith's barn near the Masonic Hall, with a stable behind it and a gasoline pump standing stiffly next to the horse trough. The only edifice in the entire settlement which really caught the eye was a peculiar bright blue shop, very un-British. Every other building was painted a sober brown. The public school and the Church of England stood side by side, just opposite the Sacred Heart Church and parish school. As the Clearys hurried past the general store, the Catholic bell sounded, followed by the heavier tolling of the big bell on a post in front of the public school. Bob broke into a trot, and they entered the gravel yard as some 50 children were lining up in front of a diminutive nun, wielding a willowy stick taller than she was. Without having to be told, Bob steered his kin to one side away from the lines of children and stood with his eyes fixed on the cane. The Sacred Heart convent was 2-storied, but because it stood well back from the road behind a fence, the fact was not easily apparent. The 3 nuns of the Order of the Sisters of Mercy, who staffed it, lived upstairs, with a 4th nun who acted as housekeeper and was never seen. Downstairs were the 3 big rooms in which school was taught. A wide, shady veranda ran all the way around the rectangular building, where on rainy days the children were allowed to sit decorously during their play and lunch breaks, and where on sunny days no child was permitted to set foot. Several large fig trees shaded a part of the spacious grounds, and behind the school the land sloped away a little to a grassy circle euphemistically christened the cricket pitch, from the chief activity that went on in that area. Ignoring muffled sniggers from the lined-up children, Bob and his brother stood perfectly still while the pupils marched inside to the sound of Sister Catherine plunking Faith of Our Fathers on the tinny school piano. Only when the last child had disappeared did Sister Agatha break her rigid pose. Heavy serge skirts swishing the gravel aside imperiously, she strode to where the Clearys waited. Meggie gaped at her, never having seen a nun before. The sight was truly extraordinary. 3 dabs of person, which were Sister Agatha's face and hands, the rest white starched wimple and bib glaring against layers of blackest black, with a massive rope of wooden rosary beads dangling from an iron ring that joined the ends of a wide leather belt around Sister Agatha's stout middle. Sister Agatha's skin was permanently red, from too much cleanliness, and the pressure of the knife-like edges of the wimple framing the front center of her head into something too disembodied to be called a face. Little hairs sprouted in tufts all over her chin, which the wimple ruthlessly squashed double. Her lips were quite invisible, compressed into a single line of concentration on the hard business of being the bride of Christ, in a colonial backwater with topsy-turvy seasons, when she had taken her vows in the sweet softness of a Killarney abbey over 50 years before. 2 small crimson marks were etched into the sides of her nose from the remorseless grip of her round, steel-framed spectacles, and behind them her eyes peered out suspiciously, pale blue and bitter. "Well, Robert Cleary, why are you late?" Sister Agatha barked in her dry, once Irish voice. "I'm sorry, sister," Bob replied woodenly, his blue-green eyes still riveted on the tip of the quivering cane as it waved back and forth. "Why are you late?" she repeated. "I'm sorry, sister. This is the first morning of the new school year, Robert Cleary, and I would have thought that on this morning, if not on others, you might have made an effort to be on time." Meggie shivered but plucked up her courage. "Oh, please, sister, it was my fault," she squeaked. The pale blue eyes deviated from Bob and seemed to go through and through Meggie's very soul, as she stood there gazing up in genuine innocence, not aware she was breaking the first rule of conduct in a deadly duel which went on between teachers and pupils ad infinitum. Never volunteer information. Bob kicked her swiftly on the leg, and Meggie looked at him sideways, bewildered.
Why was it your fault? The nun demanded in the coldest tones Meggie had ever heard.
Well, I was sick all over the table, and it went right through to my drawers. So Mum had to wash me and change my dress, and I made us all late, Meggie explained artlessly.
Sister Agatha's features remained expressionless, but her mouth tightened like an overwound spring, and the tip of the cane lowered itself an inch or two. "Who is this?" she snapped to Bob, as if the object of her inquiry were a new and particularly obnoxious species of insect.
"Please, sister, she's my sister Megan."
"Then in future you will make her understand that there are certain subjects we do not ever mention, Robert, if we are true ladies and gentlemen. On no account do we ever mention by name any item of our underclothing, as children from a decent household would automatically know. Hold out your hands, all of you."
"But, sister, it was my fault,"
Meggie wailed as she extended her hands palm up, for she had seen her brothers do it in pantomime at home 1,000 times. "Silence!" Sister Agatha hissed, turning on her. "It is a matter of complete indifference to me which one of you is responsible. You are all late, therefore you must all be punished. 6 cuts." She pronounced the sentence with monotonous relish. Terrified, Meggie watched Bob's steady hands, saw the long cane whistle down almost faster than her eyes could allow, and crack sharply against the center of his palms, where the flesh was soft and tender. A purple welt flared up immediately. The next cut came at the junction of fingers and palm, more sensitive still, and the final one across the tips of the fingers, where the brain has loaded the skin down with more sensation than anywhere else save the lips. Sister Agatha's aim was perfect. 3 more cuts followed on Bob's other hand before she turned her attention to Jack, next in line. Bob's face was pale, but he made no outcry or movement, nor did his brothers as their turns came. Even quiet and tender Stu. As they followed the upward rise of the cane above her own hands, Meggie's eyes closed involuntarily, so she did not see the descent. But the pain was like a vast explosion, a scorching, searing invasion of her flesh right down to the bone. Even as the ache spread, tingling up her forearm, the next cut came, and by the time it had reached her shoulder, the final cut across her fingertips was screaming along the same path, all the way through to her heart. She fastened her teeth in her lower lip and bit down on it, too ashamed and too proud to cry, too angry and indignant at the injustice of it to dare open her eyes and look at Sister Agatha. The lesson was sinking in, even if the crux of it was not what Sister Agatha intended to teach. It was lunchtime before the last of the pain died out of her hands. Meggie had passed the morning in a haze of fright and bewilderment, not understanding anything that was said or done. Pushed into a double desk in the back row of the youngest children's classroom, she did not even notice who was sharing the desk until after a miserable lunch hour spent huddled behind Bob and Jack in a secluded corner of the playground. Only Bob's stern command persuaded her to eat Fee's gooseberry jam sandwiches. When the bell rang for afternoon classes and Meggie found a place online, her eyes finally began to clear enough to take in what was going on around her. The disgrace of the caning rankled as sharply as ever, but she held her head high and affected not to notice the nudges and whispers of the little girls near her. Sister Agatha was standing in front with her cane. Sister Declan prowled up and down behind the lines. Sister Catherine seated herself at the piano just inside the youngest children's classroom door and began to play Onward Christian Soldiers with a heavy emphasis on 2/4 time. It was, properly speaking, a Protestant hymn, but the war had rendered it interdenominational. The dear children marched to it just like we soldiers, Sister Catherine thought proudly. Of the 3 nuns, Sister Declan was a replica of Sister Agatha minus 15 years of life, where Sister Catherine was still remotely human. She was only in her 30s, Irish of course, and the bloom of her ardor had not yet entirely faded. She still found joy in teaching, still saw Christ's imperishable image in the little faces turned up to hers so adoringly. But she taught the oldest children, whom Sister Agatha deemed beaten enough to behave in spite of a young and soft supervisor. Sister Agatha herself took the youngest children to form minds and hearts out of infantile clay, leaving those in the middle grades to Sister Declan. Safely hidden in the last row of desks, Meggie dared to glance sideways at the little girl sitting next to her. A gap-toothed grin met her frightened gaze,
huge black eyes staring roundly out of a dark, slightly shiny face. She fascinated Meggie, used to fairness and freckles, for even Frank with his dark eyes and hair had a fair white skin. So Meggie ended in thinking her deskmate the most beautiful creature she had ever seen. "What's your name?" the dark beauty muttered out of the side of her mouth, chewing on the end of her pencil and spitting the frayed bits into her empty inkwell hole. "Maggie Cleary," she whispered back. "You there," came a dry, harsh voice from the front of the classroom. Meggie jumped, looking around in bewilderment. There was a hollow clatter as 20 children all put their pencils down together, a muted rustling as precious sheets of paper were shuffled to one side so elbows could be surreptitiously placed on desks. With a heart that seemed to crumple down toward her boots, Meggie realized everyone was staring at her. Sister Agatha was coming down the aisle rapidly. Meggie's terror was so acute that had there only been somewhere to flee, she would have run for her life. But behind her was the partition shutting off the middle grades room. On either side desks crowded her in, and in front was Sister Agatha. Her eyes nearly filled her pinched little face as she stared up at the nun in suffocated fear, her hands clenching and unclenching on the desk top. "You spoke, Megan Cleary?" "Yes, sister." "And what did you say?" "My name, sister." "Your name?" Sister Agatha sneered, looking around at the other children as if they too surely must share her contempt. "Well, children, are we not honored? Another Cleary in our school, and she cannot wait to broadcast her name." She turned back to Meggie. "Stand up when I address you, you ignorant little savage, and hold out your hands, please." Meggie scrambled out of her seat, her long curls swinging across her face and bouncing away. Gripping her hands together, she wrung them desperately, but Sister Agatha did not move, only waited. Then somehow Meggie managed to force her hands out, but as the cane descended, she snatched them away, gasping in terror. Sister Agatha locked her fingers in the bunched hair on top of Meggie's head and hauled her closer, bringing her face up to within inches of those dreadful spectacles. "Hold out your hands, Megan Cleary." It was said courteously, coldly, implacably. Meggie opened her mouth and vomited all over the front of Sister Agatha's habit. There was a horrified intake of breath from every child in the room as Sister Agatha stood with the disgusting sick dripping down her black pleats onto the floor, her face purple with rage and astonishment. Then down came the cane, anywhere it could land on Meggie's body as she flung up her arms to shield her face and cringed, still retching, into the corner. When Sister Agatha's arm was so tired it did not want to lift the cane, she pointed toward the door. "Go home, you revolting little Philistine," she said, turned on her heel and went through into Sister Declan's classroom. Meggie's frantic gaze found Stu. He nodded his head as if to tell her she must do as she was told, his soft blue-green eyes full of pity and understanding. Wiping her mouth with her handkerchief, she stumbled through the door and out into the playground. There were still 2 hours to go before school was dismissed. She plodded down the street without interest, knowing there was no chance the boys would catch up with her, and too frightened to find somewhere to wait for them. She had to go home on her own, confess to Mum on her own. Fee nearly fell over her as she staggered out of the back door with a full basket of wet washing. Meggie was sitting on the top step of the back veranda, her head down, the ends of her bright curls sticky and the front of her dress stained. Putting down the crushing weight of the basket, Fee sighed, pushed a strand of wayward hair out of her eyes. "Well, what happened?" she demanded tiredly. "I was sick all over, Sister Agatha." "Oh, Lord," Fee said, her hands on her hips. "I got caned, too," Meggie whispered, the tears standing unshed in her eyes. "A nice kettle of fish, I must say." Fee heaved her basket up, swaying until she got it balanced. "Well, Meggie, I don't know what to do with you. We'll have to wait and see what Daddy says." And she walked off across the backyard toward the flapping, half-full clotheslines. Rubbing her hands wearily around her face, Meggie stared after her mother for a moment, then got up and started down the path to the forge. Frank had just finished shoeing Mr. Robertson's bay mare, and was backing it into a stall when Meggie appeared in the doorway. He turned and saw her, and memories of his own terrible misery at school came flooding back to him. She was so little, so baby-plump and innocent and sweet, but the light in the eyes had been brutally quenched, and an expression lurked there which made him want to murder Sister Agatha. Murder her, really murder her, take the double chins and squeeze. Down went his tools, off came his apron. He walked to her quickly. "What's the matter, dear?" he asked, bending over until her face was level with his own. The smell of vomit rose from her like a miasma, but he crushed his impulse to turn away. "Oh, Frank," she wailed, her face twisting up and her tears undammed at last. She threw her arms around his neck and clung to him passionately, weeping in the curiously silent, painful way all the Cleary children did once they were out of infancy. It was horrible to watch, and not something soft words or kisses could heal. When she was calm again, he picked her up and carried her to a pile of sweet-smelling hay near Mr. Robertson's mare. They sat there together and let the horse lip at the edges of their straw bed, lost to the world. Maggie's head was cradled on Frank's smooth, bare chest, tendrils of her hair flying around as the horse blew gusty breaths into the hay, snorting with pleasure. "Why did she cane all of us, Frank?" Maggie asked. "I told her it was my fault." Frank had got used to her smell and didn't mind it any more. He reached out a hand and absently stroked the mare's nose, pushing it away when it got too inquisitive. "We're poor, Maggie, that's the main reason. The nuns always hate poor pupils. After you've been in Sister Ag's mouldy old school a few days, you'll see it's not only the Clearys she takes it out on, but the Marshalls and the MacDonalds as well. We're all poor. Now, if we were rich and rode to school in a big carriage like the O'Briens, they'd be all over us like a rash. But we can't donate organs to the church, or gold vestments to the sacristy, or a new horse and buggy to the nuns. So we don't matter. They can do what they like to us." I remember one day Sister Ag was so mad at me that she kept screaming at me, "Cry for the love of heaven, make a noise, Francis Cleary. If you'd give me the satisfaction of hearing you bellow, I wouldn't hit you so hard or so often." That's another reason why she hates us. It's where we're better than the Marshalls and the MacDonalds. She can't make the Clearys cry. We're supposed to lick her boots. Well, I told the boys what I'd do to any Cleary who even whimpered when he was caned, and that goes for you too, Maggie. No matter how hard she beats you, not a whimper. Did you cry today? No, Frank. She yawned, her eyelids drooping and her thumb poking blindly across her face in search of her mouth. Frank put her down in the hay and went back to his work, humming and 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 back to his work, humming and... What happened then? Sister Ag caned her good and proper and sent her home in disgrace. Well, I'd say she'd had punishment enough. I have a lot of respect for the nuns, and I know it isn't our place to question what they do, but I wish they were a bit less eager with the cane. I know they have to beat the 3 hours into our thick Irish heads, but after all, it was wee Maggie's first day at school. Frank was staring at his father amazed. Not until this moment had Paddy ever communicated man-to-man with his oldest son. Shocked out of perpetual resentment, Frank realized that for all his proud boasting, Paddy loved Maggie more than he did his sons. He found himself almost liking his father, so he smiled without the mistrust. "She's a bonza little thing, isn't she?" he asked. Paddy nodded absently, engrossed in watching her. The horse blew its lips in and out, flapping. Maggie stirred, rolled over, and opened her eyes. When she saw her father standing beside Frank, she sat bolt upright, fright paling her skin. "Well, Maggie girl, you've had quite the day, haven't you?" Paddy went over and lifted her out of the hay, gasping as he caught a whiff of her. Then he shrugged his shoulders and held her against him hard. "I got caned, Daddy," she confessed. "Well, knowing Sister Agatha, it won't be the last time." He laughed, perching her on his shoulder. "We'd better see if Mum's got any hot water in the copper to give you a bath.
You smell worse than Yarman's dairy."
Frank went to the doorway and watched the two fiery heads bobbing up the path, then turned to find the bay mare's gentle eyes fixed on him.
"Come on, you big old bitch. I'll ride you home," he told it, scooping up a halter.
Maggie's vomiting turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Sister Agatha still caned her regularly, but always from far enough away to escape the consequences, which lessened the strength of her arm and quite spoiled her aim. The dark child who sat next to her was the youngest daughter of the Italian man who owned and operated Wahine's bright blue cafe. Her name was Teresa Annunzio, and she was just dull enough to escape Sister Agatha's attention without being so dull that it turned her into Sister Agatha's butt. When her teeth grew in, she was quite strikingly beautiful, and Maggie adored her. During lesson breaks in the playground, they walked with arms looped around each other's waists, which was the sign that you were best friends and not available for courting by anyone else. And they talked. One lunchtime, Teresa took her into the cafe to meet her mother and father and grown-up brothers and sisters. They were as charmed with her golden fire as Maggie was with their darkness, likening her to an angel when she turned her wide, beautifully flecked gray eyes upon them. From her mother she had inherited an indefinable air of breeding, which everyone felt immediately. So did the Annunzio family. As eager as Teresa to woo her, they gave her big fat potato chips fried in sizzling cauldrons of lamb dripping, and a piece of boned fish which tasted delicious, dipped as it was in floury batter, and fried in the smoking well of liquid fat along with the chips, only in a separate wire basket. Maggie had never eaten food so delicious and wished she could lunch at the cafe more often. But this had been a treat, requiring special permission from her mother and the nuns. Her conversation at home was all, "Teresa says," and "Do you know what Teresa did?" until Paddy roared that he had heard more than enough about Teresa.
"I don't know that it's such a good idea to be too thick with Dagos," he muttered, sharing the British community's instinctive mistrust of any dark or Mediterranean people. "Dagos are dirty, Meggie girl. They don't wash too often," he explained lamely, wilting under the look of hurt reproach Maggie gave him. Fiercely jealous, Frank agreed with him. So Maggie spoke less often of her friend when she was at home. But home disapproval couldn't interfere with the relationship, confined as it was by distance to school days and hours. Bob and the boys were only too pleased to see her utterly engrossed in Teresa. It left them to career madly around the playground just as if their sister did not exist. The unintelligible thing Sister Agatha was always writing on the blackboard gradually began to make sense, and Maggie learned that a plus meant you counted all the numbers up to a total, where a minus meant you took the numbers on the bottom away from the numbers on the top and wound up with less than you had in the first place. She was a bright child, and would have been an excellent, if not brilliant, student had she only been able to overcome her fear of Sister Agatha. But the minute those gimlet eyes turned her way and that dry old voice rapped a curt question at her, she stammered and stuttered and could not think. Arithmetic she found easy, but when called upon to demonstrate her skill verbally, she could not remember how many 2 and 2 made. Reading was the entrance into a world so fascinating she couldn't get enough of it, but when Sister Agatha made her stand to read a passage out loud, she could hardly pronounce cat, let alone meow. It seemed to her that she was forever quivering under Sister Agatha's sarcastic comments, or flushing bright red because the rest of the class was laughing at her. For it was always her slate Sister Agatha held up to sneer at, always her laboriously written sheets of paper Sister Agatha used to demonstrate the ugliness of untidy work. Some of the richer children were lucky enough to possess erasers, but Maggie's only eraser was the tip of her finger, which she licked and rubbed over her nervous mistakes, until the writing smudged and the paper came away in miniature sausages. It made holes and was strictly forbidden, but she was desperate enough to do anything to avoid Sister Agatha's strictures. Until her advent, Stuart had been the chief target of Sister Agatha's cane and venom. However, Maggie was a much better target, for Stuart's wistful tranquility and almost saint-like aloofness were hard nuts to crack, even for Sister Agatha. On the other hand, Maggie trembled and went red as a beet for all she tried so manfully to adhere to the Cleary line of behavior as defined by Frank. Stuart pitied Maggie deeply and tried to make it easier for her by deliberately sidetracking the nun's anger onto his own head. She saw through his ploys immediately, angered afresh to see the Cleary clannishness as much in evidence with the girl as it had always been among the boys. Had anyone questioned her as to exactly why she had such a down on the Clearys, she would not have been able to answer. But for an old nun, as embittered by the course her life had taken as Sister Agatha, a proud and touchy family like the Clearys was not easy to swallow. Maggie's worst sin was being left-handed. When she gingerly picked up her slate pencil to embark on her first writing lesson, Sister Agatha descended on her like Caesar on the Gauls. "Megan Cleary, put that pencil down," she thundered. Thus began a battle royal. Meggie was incurably and hopelessly left-handed. When Sister Agatha forcibly bent the fingers of Maggie's right hand correctly around the pencil and poised it above the slate, Meggie sat there with her head reeling, and no idea in the world how to make the afflicted limb do what Sister Agatha insisted it could. She became mentally deaf, dumb, and blind. That useless appendage, her right hand, was no more linked to her thought processes than her toes. She dribbled a line clean off the edge of the slate because she could not make it bend. She dropped her pencil as if paralyzed. Nothing Sister Agatha could do would make Maggie's right hand form an A. Then, surreptitiously, Meggie would transfer her pencil to her left hand, and with her arm curled awkwardly around 3 sides of the slate, she would make a row of beautiful copperplate A's. Sister Agatha won the battle. On morning line-up, she tied Maggie's left arm against her body with rope, and would not undo it until the dismissal bell rang at 3 in the afternoon. Even at lunchtime, she had to eat, walk around, and play games with her left side firmly immobilized. It took 3 months, but eventually she learned to write correctly according to the tenets of Sister Agatha, though the formation of her letters was never good. To make sure she would never revert back to using it, her left arm was kept tied to her body for a further 2 months. Then Sister Agatha made the whole school assemble to say a rosary of thanks to Almighty God for His wisdom in making Meggie see the error of her ways. God's children were all right-handed. Left-handed children were the spawn of the devil, especially when red-headed. In that first year of school, Meggie lost her baby plumpness and became very thin, though she grew little in height. She began to bite her nails down to the quick, and had to endure Sister Agatha's making her walk around every desk in the school, holding her hands out so all the children could see how ugly bitten nails were. And this was when nearly half the children between 5 and 15 bit their nails as badly as Meggie did. Fee got out the bottle of bitter aloes and painted the tips of Maggie's fingers with the horrible stuff. Everyone in the family was enlisted to make sure she got no opportunity to wash the bitter aloes off, and when the other little girls at school noticed the telltale brown stains, she was mortified. If she put her fingers in her mouth, the taste was indescribable, foul, and dark like sheep dip. In desperation, she spat on her handkerchief and rubbed herself raw until she got rid of the worst of it. Paddy took out his switch, a much gentler instrument than Sister Agatha's cane, and sent her skipping round the kitchen. He did not believe in beating his children on the hands, face, or buttocks, only on the legs. Legs hurt as much as anywhere, he said, and could not be damaged. However, in spite of bitter aloes, ridicule, Sister Agatha, and Paddy's switch, Meggie went on biting her nails. Her friendship with Teresa Annunzio was the joy of her life, the only thing that made school endurable. She sat through lessons, aching for playtime to come, so she could sit with her arm around Teresa's waist and Teresa's arm around hers under the big fir tree, talking. There were tales about Teresa's extraordinary alien family, about her numerous dolls, and about her genuine willow-pattern tea set. When Meggie saw the tea set, she was overcome. It had 108 pieces, tiny miniature cups and saucers and plates, a teapot and a sugar bowl and a milk jug and a cream jug, with wee knives and spoons and forks, just the right size for dolls to use. Teresa had innumerable toys. Besides being much younger than her nearest sister, she belonged to an Italian family, which meant she was passionately and openly loved, and indulged to the full extent of her father's monetary resources. Each child viewed the other with awe and envy, though Teresa never coveted Meggie's Calvinistic Stoic upbringing. Instead, she pitied her. Not to be allowed to run to her mother with hugs and kisses? Poor Meggie!
As for Meggie, she was incapable of equating Teresa's beaming, portly little mother with her own slender, unsmiling mother. So she never thought, "I wish Mum hugged and kissed me." What she did think was, "I wish Teresa's mum hugged and kissed me." Though images of hugs and kisses were far less in her mind than images of the willow-patterned tea set. So delicate, so thin and wafery, so beautiful. Oh, if only she had a willow-patterned tea set and could give Agnes afternoon tea out of a deep blue and white cup in a deep blue and white saucer. During Friday benediction in the old church, with its lovely, grotesque Maori carvings and Maori painted ceiling, Meggie knelt to pray for a willow-patterned tea set of her very own. When Father Hayes held the monstrance aloft, the host peered dimly through the glass window in the middle of its gem-encrusted rays and blessed the bowed heads of the congregation. All save Meggie, that is, for she didn't even see the host. She was too busy trying to remember how many plates there were in Teresa's willow-patterned tea set. And when the Maoris in the organ gallery broke into glorious song, Meggie's head was spinning in a daze of ultramarine blue, far removed from Catholicism or Polynesia. The school year was drawing to a close, December and her birthday just beginning to threaten full summer, when Meggie learned how dearly one could buy the desire of one's heart. She was sitting on a high stool near the stove while Fee did her hair as usual for school. It was an intricate business. Maggie's hair had a natural tendency to curl, which her mother considered to be a great piece of good luck. Girls with straight hair had a hard time of it when they grew up and tried to produce glorious wavy masses out of limp, thin strands. At night, Meggie slept with her almost knee-length locks twisted painfully around bits of old white sheet torn into long strips, and each morning she had to clamber up on the stool while Fee undid the rags and brushed her curls in. Fee used an old Mason Pearson hairbrush, taking one long, scraggly curl in her left hand and expertly brushing the hair around her index finger until the entire length of it was rolled into a shining, thick sausage. Then she carefully withdrew her finger from the center of the roll and shook it out into a long, enviably thick curl. This maneuver was repeated some 12 times. The front curls were then drawn together on Meggie's crown with a freshly ironed white taffeta bow, and she was ready for the day. All the other little girls wore braids to school, saving curls for special occasions, but on this one point Fee was adamant. Meggie should have curls all the time, no matter how hard it was to spare the minutes each morning. Had Fee realized it, her charity was misguided, for her daughter's hair was far and away the most beautiful in the entire school. To rub the fact in with daily curls earned Meggie much envy and loathing. The process hurt, but Meggie was too used to it to notice, never remembering a time when it had not been done. Fee's muscular arm yanked the brush ruthlessly through knots and tangles until Meggie's eyes watered, and she had to hang onto the stool with both hands to keep from falling off. It was the Monday of the last week at school, and her birthday was only 2 days away. She clung to the stool and dreamed about the willow-patterned tea set, knowing it for a dream. There was one in the Wahine General Store, and she knew enough of prices to realize that its cost put it far beyond her father's slender means. Suddenly, Fee made a sound so peculiar it jerked Meggie out of her musing and made the menfolks still seated at the breakfast table turn their heads curiously. "Holy Jesus Christ!" said Fee. Paddy jumped to his feet, his face stupefied. He had never heard Fee take the name of the Lord in vain before. She was standing with one of Meggie's curls in her hand, the brush poised, her features twisted into an expression of horror and revulsion. Paddy and the boys crowded round. Meggie tried to see what was going on, and earned a backhanded slap with the bristle end of the brush which made her eyes water. "Look!" Fee whispered, holding the curl in a ray of sunlight so Paddy could see. The hair was a mass of brilliant, glittering gold in the sun, and Paddy saw nothing at first. Then he became aware that a creature was marching down the back of Fee's hand. He took a curl for himself, and in among the leaping lights of it, he discerned more creatures, going about their business busily. Little white things were stuck in clumps all along the separate strands, and the creatures were energetically producing more clumps of little white things. Meggie's hair was a hive of industry. "She's got lice," Paddy said. Bob, Jack, Hughie, and Stu had a look, and like their father removed themselves to a safe distance. Only Frank and Fee remained gazing at Maggie's hair, mesmerized, while Maggie sat miserably hunched over, wondering what she had done. Paddy sat down in his Windsor chair heavily, staring into the fire and blinking hard.
"It's that bloody Dago girl,"
he said at last, and turned to glare at Fee.
"Bloody bastards, filthy lot of flaming pigs."
"Paddy," Fee gasped, scandalized.
"I'm sorry for swearing, Mum, but when I think of that blasted Dago giving her life to Meggie, I could go into Wahine this minute and tear the whole filthy, greasy cafe down,"
he exploded, pounding his fist on his knee fiercely.
"Mum, what is it?"
Maggie finally managed to say. "Look, you dirty little grub," her mother answered, thrusting her hand down in front of Maggie's eyes. "You have these things everywhere in your hair, from that IT girl you're so thick with. Now, what am I going to do with you?" Maggie gaped at the tiny thing roaming blindly round Fee's bare skin in search of more hirsute territory. Then she began to weep. Without needing to be told, Frank got the copper going, while Paddy paced up and down the kitchen, roaring, his rage increasing every time he looked at Maggie. Finally, he went to the row of hooks on the wall inside the back door, jammed his hat on his head, and took the long horsewhip from its nail.
"I'm going into Wahine, Fee, and I'm going to tell that blasted Dago what he can do with his slimy fish and chips. Then I'm going to see Sister Agatha and tell her what I think of her, allowing lousy children in her school."
"Paddy, be careful," Fee pleaded. "What if it isn't the IT girl? Even if she has lice, it's possible she might have got them from someone else along with Maggie."
"Rot,"
said Paddy scornfully. He pounded down the back steps, and a few minutes later they heard his roan's hoofs beating down the road. Fee sighed, looking at Frank hopelessly. "Well, I suppose we'll be lucky if he doesn't land in jail. Frank, you'd better bring the boys inside. No school today." One by one, Fee went through her son's hair minutely, then checked Frank's head and made him do the same for her. There was no evidence that anyone else had acquired poor Maggie's malady, but Fee did not intend to take chances. When the water in the huge laundry copper was boiling, Frank got the dish tub down from its hanging and filled it half with hot water and half with cold. Then he went out to the shed and fetched in an unopened 5-gallon can of kerosene, took out a bar of lye soap from the laundry, and started work on Bob. Each head was briefly damped in the tub, several cups of raw kerosene poured over it, and the whole draggled, greasy mess lathered with soap. The kerosene and lye burned. The boys howled and rubbed their eyes raw, scratching at their reddened, tingling scalps and threatening ghastly vengeance on all Dagos. Fee went to her sewing basket and took out her big shears. She came back to Maggie, who had not dared to move from the stool, though an hour and more had elapsed, and stood with the shears in her hand, staring at the beautiful fall of hair. Then she began to cut it, snip, snip, until all the long curls were huddled in glistening heaps on the floor, and Maggie's white skin was beginning to show in irregular patches all over her head. Doubt in her eyes, she turned then to Frank. "Ought I to shave it?" she asked, tight-lipped. Frank put out his hand, revolted. "Oh, Mum, no, surely not. If she gets a good douse of kerosene, it ought to be enough. Please don't shave it." So Maggie was marched to the work-table and held over the tub while they poured cup after cup of kerosene over her head and scrubbed the corrosive soap through what was left of her hair. When they were finally satisfied, she was almost blind from screwing up her eyes against the bite of the caustic, and little rows of blisters had risen all over her face and scalp. Frank swept the fallen curls into a sheet of paper and thrust it into the copper fire, then took the broom and stood it in a pan full of kerosene. He and Fee both washed their hair, gasping as the lye seared their skins. Then Frank got out a bucket and scrubbed the kitchen floor with sheep dip. When the kitchen was as sterile as a hospital, they went through to the bedrooms, stripped every sheet and blanket from every bed, and spent the rest of the day boiling, wringing, and pegging out the family linen. The mattresses and pillows were draped over the back fence and sprayed with kerosene. The parlor rugs were beaten within an inch of their lives. All the boys were put to helping, only Maggie exempted because she was an absolute disgrace. She crawled away behind the barn and cried. Her head throbbed with pain from the scrubbing, the burns and the blisters, and she was so bitterly ashamed that she would not even look at Frank when he came to find her, nor could he persuade her to come inside. In the end he had to drag her into the house by brute force, kicking and fighting, and she had pushed herself into a corner when Paddy came back from Wahine in the late afternoon. He took one look at Maggie's shorn head and burst into tears, sitting rocking himself in the Windsor chair with his hands over his face, while the family stood shuffling their feet and wishing they were anywhere but where they were. Fee made a pot of tea and poured Paddy a cup as he began to recover. "What happened in Wahine?" she asked. "You were gone an awful long time." "I took the horsewhip to that blasted Dago and threw him into the horse trough for one thing. Then I noticed MacLeod standing outside his shop watching, so I told him what had happened. MacLeod mustered some of the chaps at the pub, and we threw the whole lot of those Dagos into the horse trough, women too, and tipped a few gallons of sheep dip into it. Then I went down to the school and saw Sister Agatha, and I tell you she was fit to be tied, that she hadn't noticed anything. She hauled the Dago girl out of her desk to look in her hair, and sure enough, lice all over the place. So she sent the girl home, and told her not to come back until her head was clean. I left her and Sister Declan and Sister Catherine looking through every head in the school, and there turned out to be a lot of lousy ones. Those 3 nuns were scratching themselves like mad when they thought no one was watching." He grinned at the memory. Then he saw Maggie's head again and sobered. He stared at her grimly. "As for you, young lady, no more Dagos or anyone except your brothers. If they aren't good enough for you, too bad. Bob, I'm telling you that Maggie's to have nothing to do with anyone except you and the boys while she's at school. Do you hear?" Bob nodded. "Yes, Daddy." The next morning Maggie was horrified to discover that she was expected to go to school as usual. No, I can't go," she moaned, her hands clutching at her head. Mum, I can't go to school like this. Not with Sister Agatha." "Oh, yes, you can," her mother replied, ignoring Frank's imploring looks. "It'll teach you a lesson." So off to school went Maggie, her feet dragging and her head done up in a brown bandana. Sister Agatha ignored her entirely, but at playtime the other girls caught her and tore her scarf away to see what she looked like. Her face was only mildly disfigured, but her head when uncovered was a horrible sight, oozing and angry. The moment he saw what was going on, Bob came over and took his sister away into a secluded corner of the cricket pitch. "Don't you take any notice of them, Maggie," he said roughly, tying the scarf around her head awkwardly and patting her stiff shoulders. "Spiteful little cats. I wish I'd thought to catch some of those things out of your head. I'm sure they'd keep. The minute everyone forgot, I'd sprinkle a few heads with a new lot." The other Cleary boys gathered around, and they sat guarding Maggie until the bell rang. Teresa Annunzio came to school briefly at lunchtime, her head shaven. She tried to attack Maggie, but the boys held her off easily. As she backed away, she flung her right arm up in the air, its fist clenched, and slapped her left hand on its biceps in a fascinating, mysterious gesture no one understood, but which the boys avidly filed away for future use. "I hate you," Teresa screamed. "Me dad's got to move out of the district because of what your dad did to him." She turned and ran from the playground, howling. Maggie held her head up and kept her eyes dry. She was learning. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. It didn't. The other girls avoided her, half because they were frightened of Bob and Jack, half because the word had got around their parents, and they had been instructed to keep away. Being thick with the Clearys usually meant trouble of some kind. So Maggie passed the last few days of school in Coventry, as they called it, which meant she was totally ostracized. Even Sister Agatha respected the new policy and took her rages out on Stuart instead. As were all birthdays among the little ones if they fell on a school day, Maggie's birthday celebration was delayed until Saturday, when she received the longed-for willow-pattern tea set. It was arranged on a beautifully crafted ultramarine table and chairs made in Frank's non-existent spare time, and Agnes was seated on one of the 2 tiny chairs, wearing a new blue dress made in Fee's non-existent spare time. Maggie stared dismally at the blue and white designs gambolling all around each small piece, at the fantastic trees with their funny puffy blossoms, at the ornate little pagoda, at the strangely still pair of birds, and the minute figures eternally fleeing across the kinky bridge. It had lost every bit of its enchantment. but dimly she understood why the family had beggared itself to get her the thing they thought dearest to her heart. So she dutifully made tea for Agnes in the tiny square teapot, and went through the ritual as if in ecstasy. And she continued doggedly to use it for years, never breaking or so much as chipping a single piece. No one ever dreamed that she loathed the willow-patterned tea set, the blue table and chairs, and Agnes's blue dress. 2 days before that Christmas of 1917, Paddy brought home his weekly newspaper and a new stack of books from the library. However, the paper for once took precedence over the books. Its editors had conceived a novel idea based on the fancy American magazines, which very occasionally found their way to New Zealand. The entire middle section was a feature on the war. There were blurred photographs of the Anzacs storming the pitiless cliffs at Gallipoli, long articles extolling the bravery of the Antipodean soldier, features on all the Australian and New Zealand winners of the Victoria Cross since its inception, and a magnificent full-page etching of an Australian light horse cavalryman mounted on his charger, sabre at the ready, and long silky feathers pluming from under the turned-up side of his slouch hat. At first opportunity, Frank seized the paper and read the feature hungrily, drinking in its jingoistic prose, his eyes glowing eerily. "Daddy, I want to go," he said as he laid the paper down reverently on the table. Fee's head jerked around as she slopped stew all over the top of the stove, and Paddy stiffened in his Windsor chair, his book forgotten. "You're too young, Frank," he said. "No, I'm not. I'm 17, Daddy. I'm a man. Why should the Huns and Turks slaughter our men like pigs while I'm sitting here safe and sound? It's more than time a Cleary did his bit." "You're underage, Frank. They won't take you." "They will if you don't object," Frank countered quickly, his dark eyes fixed on Paddy's face. "But I do object. You're the only one working at the moment, and we need the money you bring in, you know that." "But I'll be paid in the army." Paddy laughed. "The soldier shilling, eh? Being a blacksmith in Wahine pays a lot better than being a soldier in Europe." "But I'll be over there. Maybe I'll get the chance to be something better than a blacksmith. It's my only way out, Daddy." "Nonsense. Good God, boy. You don't know what you're saying. War is terrible. I come from a country that's been at war for 1,000 years, so I know what I'm saying. Haven't you heard the Boer War chaps talking? You go into Wahine often enough, so next time listen. And anyway, it strikes me that the blasted English use Anzacs as fodder for the enemy guns, putting them into places where they don't want to waste their own precious troops. Look at the way that sabre-rattling Churchill sent our man into something as useless as Gallipoli. 10,000 killed out of 50,000. Twice as bad as decimation. Why should you go fighting old Mother England's wars for her? What has she ever done for you except bleed her colonies white? If you went to England, they'd look down their noses at you for being a colonial. NZ isn't in any danger, nor is Australia. It might do old Mother England the world of good to be defeated. It's more than time someone paid her for what she's done to Ireland. I certainly wouldn't weep any tears if the Kaiser ended up marching down the Strand." "But, Daddy, I want to enlist." "You can want all you like, Frank, but you aren't going. So you may as well forget the whole idea. You're not big enough to be a soldier." Frank's face flushed. His lips came together. His lack of stature was a very sore point with him. At school he had always been the smallest boy in his class, and fought twice as many battles as anyone else because of it. Of late a terrible doubt had begun to invade his being, for at 17 he was exactly the same 5'3" he had been at 14. Perhaps he had stopped growing. Only he knew the agonies to which he subjected his body and his spirit, the stretching, the exercises, the fruitless hoping. Smithying had given him a strength out of all proportion to his height, however. Had Paddy consciously chosen a profession for someone of Frank's temperament, he could not have chosen better. A small structure of pure power, at 17 he had never been defeated in a fight, and was already famous throughout the Taranaka Peninsula. All his anger, frustration, and inferiority came into a fight with him, and they were more than the biggest, strongest local could contend with, allied as they were to a body in superb physical condition, an excellent brain,
viciousness and indomitable will. The bigger and tougher they were, the more Frank wanted to see them humbled in the dust. His peers trod a wide detour around him, for his aggressiveness was well known. Of late he had branched out of the ranks of youths in his search for challenges, and the local men still talked about the day he had beaten Jim Collins to a pulp, though Jim Collins was 22 years old, stood 6'4" in his socks, and could lift horses. With his left arm broken and his ribs cracked, Frank had fought on until Jim Collins was a slobbering mass of bloodied flesh at his feet, and he had to be forcibly restrained from kicking the senseless face in. As soon as the arm healed and the ribs came out of strapping, Frank went into town and lifted a horse, just to show that Jim wasn't the only one who could, and that it didn't depend on a man's size. As the sire of this phenomenon, Paddy knew Frank's reputation very well, and understood Frank's battle to gain respect, though it did not prevent his becoming angry when fighting interfered with the work in the forge. Being a small man himself, Paddy had had his share of fights to prove his courage, but in his part of Ireland he was not diminutive, and by the time he arrived in New Zealand, where men were taller, he was a man grown. Thus his size was never the obsession with him it was with Frank. Now he watched the boy carefully, trying to understand him, and failing. This one had always been the farthest from his heart, no matter how he struggled against discriminating among his children. He knew it grieved Fee, that she worried over the unspoken antagonism between them, but even his love for Fee could not overcome his exasperation with Frank. Frank's short, finely made hands were spread across the open paper defensively, his eyes riveted on Paddy's face in a curious mixture of pleading and a pride that was too stiff-necked to plead. How alien the face was. No Cleary or Armstrong in it, except perhaps a little look of Fee around the eyes, if Fee's eyes had been dark and could have snapped and flashed the way Frank's did on slightest provocation. One thing the lad did not lack, and that was courage. The subject ended abruptly with Paddy's remark about Frank's size. The family ate stewed rabbit in unusual silence, even Hughie and Jack treading carefully through a sticky, self-conscious conversation, punctuated by much shrill giggling. Maggie refused to eat, fixing her gaze on Frank as if he were going to disappear from sight any moment. Frank picked at his food for a decent interval, and as soon as he could, excused himself from the table. A minute later they heard the axe clunking dully from the wood heap. Frank was attacking the hardwood logs Paddy had brought home to store for the slow-burning fires of winter. When everyone thought she was in bed, Maggie squeezed out of her bedroom window and sneaked down to the wood heap. It was a tremendously important area in the continuing life of the house, about 1,000 square feet of ground padded and deadened by a thick layer of chips and bark, great high stacks of logs on one side waiting to be reduced in size, and on the other side mosaic-like walls of neatly prepared wood, just the right size for the stove firebox. In the middle of the open space, 3 tree stumps still rooted in the ground were used as blocks to chop different heights of wood. Frank was not on a block. He was working on a massive eucalyptus log and undercutting it to get it small enough to place on the lowest, widest stump. Its 2-foot diameter bulk lay on the earth, each end immobilized by an iron spike, and Frank was standing on top of it, cutting it in two between his spread feet. The axe was moving so fast it whistled, and the handle made its own separate swishing sound as it slid up and down within his slippery palms. Up it flashed above his head, down it came in a dull silver blur, carving a wedge-shaped chunk out of the iron-hard wood as easily as if it had been a pine or a deciduous tree. Sundered pieces of wood were flying in all directions. The sweat was running in streams down Frank's bare chest and back, and he had wound his handkerchief about his brow to keep the sweat from blinding him. It was dangerous work, undercutting. One mistimed or badly directed hack, and he would be minus a foot. He had his leather wristbands on to soak up the sweat from his arms, but the delicate hands were ungloved, gripping the axe handle lightly and with exquisitely directed skill. Meggie crouched down beside his discarded shirt and undervest to watch, awed. 3 spare axes were lying nearby, for eucalyptus wood blunted the sharpest axe in no time at all. She grasped one by its handle and dragged it onto her knees, wishing she could chop wood like Frank. The axe was so heavy she could hardly lift it. Colonial axes had only one blade, honed to hair-splitting sharpness, for double-bladed axes were too light for eucalyptus. The back of the axe head was an inch thick and weighted, the handle passing through it, firmly anchored with small bits of extra wood. A loose axe head could come off in mid-swing and snap through the air as hard and fast as a cannonball, kill someone. Frank was cutting almost instinctively in the fast-fading light. Maggie dodged the chips with the ease of long practice and waited patiently for him to spy her. The log was half severed, and he turned himself the opposite way, gasping. Then he swung the axe up again and began to cut the second side. It was a deep, narrow gap to conserve wood and hasten the process. As he worked toward the center of the log, the axe head disappeared entirely inside the cut, and the big wedges of wood flew out closer and closer to his body. He ignored them, chopping even faster. The log parted with stunning suddenness, and at the same moment he leaped lithely into the air, sensing that it was going almost before the axe took its last bite. As the wood collapsed inward, he landed off to one side, smiling. But it was not a happy smile. He turned to pick up a new axe and saw his sister sitting patiently in her prim nightgown, all buttoned up and buttoned down. It was still strange to see her hair clustering in a mass of short ringlets instead of done up in its customary rags, but he decided the boyish style suited her, and wished it could remain so. Coming over to her, he squatted down with his axe held across his knees. "How did you get out, you little twerp?"
"I climbed through the window after Stu was asleep."
"If you don't watch out, you'll turn into a tomboy."
"I don't mind. Playing with the boys is better than playing all by myself."
"I suppose it is." He sat down with his back against a log and wearily turned his head toward her. "What's the matter, Maggie?"
"Frank, you're not really going away, are you?" She put her hands with their mangled nails down on his thigh and stared up at him anxiously, her mouth open because her nose was stuffed full from fighting tears, and she couldn't breathe through it very well. "I might be, Maggie." He said it gently. "Oh, Frank, you can't. Mum and I need you. Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without you."
He grinned in spite of his pain, at her unconscious echoing of Fee's way of speaking. "Maggie, sometimes things just don't happen the way you want them to. You ought to know that. We Clearys have been taught to work together for the good of all, never to think of ourselves first. But I don't agree with that. I think we ought to be able to think of ourselves first. I want to go away because I'm 17, and it's time I made a life for myself. But Daddy says no, I'm needed at home for the good of the family as a whole. And because I'm not 21, I've got to do as Daddy says." Maggie nodded earnestly, trying to untangle the threads of Frank's explanation. "Well, Maggie, I've thought long and hard about it. I'm going away, and that's that. I know you and Mum will miss me, but Bob's growing up fast, and Daddy and the boys won't miss me at all. It's only the money I bring in interests Daddy."
"Don't you like us any more, Frank?"
He turned to snatch her into his arms, hugging and caressing her in tortured pleasure, most of it grief and pain and hunger. "Oh, Maggie, I love you and Mum more than all the others put together. God, why weren't you older so I could talk to you? Or maybe it's better that you're so little, maybe it's better." He let her go abruptly, struggling to master himself, rolling his head back and forth against the log, his throat and mouth working. Then he looked at her. "Maggie, when you're older you'll understand better."
"Please don't go away, Frank,"
she repeated. He laughed, almost a sob. "Oh, Maggie, didn't you hear any of it? Well, it doesn't really matter. The main thing is you're not to tell anyone you saw me tonight, hear? I don't want them thinking you're in on it."
"I did hear, Frank. I heard all of it," Maggie said. "I won't say a word to anybody, though, I promise. But oh, I do wish you wouldn't have to go away."
She was too young to be able to tell him what was no more than an unreasoning something within her heart. Who else was there if Frank went? He was the only one who gave her overt affection, the only one who held her and hugged her. When she was smaller, Daddy used to pick her up a lot, but ever since she started at school he had stopped letting her sit on his knee, wouldn't let her throw her arms around his neck, saying, "You're a big girl now, Maggie." And Mum was always so busy, so tired, so wrapped in the boys and the house. It was Frank who lay closest to her heart, Frank who loomed as the star in her limited heaven. He was the only one who seemed to enjoy sitting, talking to her, and he explained things in a way she could understand. Ever since the day Agnes had lost her hair, there had been Frank, and in spite of her sore troubles, nothing since had speared her quite to the core. Not canes, or Sister Agatha, or lice, because Frank was there to comfort and console. But she got up and managed to smile. "If you have to go, Frank, then it's all right." "Maggie, you ought to be in bed, and you'd better be back there before Mum checks. Scoot, quickly." The reminder drove all else from her head. She thrust her face down and fished for the trailing back of her gown, pulled it through between her legs, and held it like a tail in reverse in front of her as she ran, bare feet spurning the splinters and sharp chips. In the morning, Frank was gone. When Fee came to pull Maggie from her bed, she was grim and terse. Maggie hopped out like a scalded cat and dressed herself without even asking for help with all the little buttons. In the kitchen, the boys were sitting glumly around the table, and Paddy's chair was empty. So was Frank's. Maggie slid into her place and sat there, teeth chattering in fear. After breakfast, Fee shooed them outside doorly, and behind the barn, Bob broke the news to Maggie. "Frank's run away," he breathed. "Maybe he's just gone into Wahine," Maggie suggested. "No, silly. He's gone to join the army. Oh, I wish I was big enough to go with him. The lucky coot." "Well, I wish he was still at home." Bob shrugged. "You're only a girl, and that's what I'd expect a girl to say." The normally incendiary remark was permitted to pass unchallenged. Maggie took herself inside to her mother to see what she could do. "Where's Daddy?" she asked Fee after her mother had set her to ironing handkerchiefs. "Gone into Wahine." "Will he bring Frank back with him?" Fee snorted. "Trying to keep a secret in this family is impossible." "No, he won't catch Frank in Wahine, he knows that. He's gone to send a telegram to the police and the army in Wanganui. They'll bring him back." "Oh, Mum, I hope they find him. I don't want Frank to go away." Fee slapped the contents of the butter churn onto the table and attacked the watery yellow mound with 2 wooden pats. "None of us want Frank to go away. That's why Daddy's going to see he's brought back." Her mouth quivered for a moment. She whacked the butter harder. "Poor Frank. Poor, poor Frank," she sighed, not to Maggie but to herself. "I don't know why the children must pay for our sins. My poor Frank, so out of things." Then she noticed that Maggie had stopped ironing, and shut her lips and said no more. 3 days later the police brought Frank back. He had put up a terrific struggle, though Wanganui sergeant on escort duty told Paddy. "What a fighter you've got! When he saw the army lads were awake up, he was off like a shot, down the steps and into the street with 2 soldiers after him. If he hadn't had the bad luck to run into a constable on patrol, I reckon he'd have got away too. He put up a real wacko fight. Took 5 of them to get the manacles on." So saying, he removed Frank's heavy chains and pushed him roughly through the front gate. He stumbled against Paddy and shrank away as if the contact stung. The children were skulking by the side of the house 20 feet beyond the adults, watching and waiting. Bob, Jack, and Huey stood stiffly, hoping Frank would put up another fight. Stuart just looked on quietly from out of his peaceful, sympathetic little soul. Maggie held her hands to her cheeks, pushing and kneading at them in an agony of fear that someone meant to hurt Frank. He turned to look at his mother first, black eyes into gray, in a dark and bitter communion which had never been spoken, nor ever was. Paddy's fierce blue gaze beat him down, contemptuous and scathing, as if this was what he had expected, and Frank's downcast lids acknowledged his right to be angry. From that day forward, Paddy never spoke to his son beyond common civility. But it was the children Frank found hardest to face, ashamed and embarrassed, the bright bird brought home with the sky unplumbed, wings clipped, song drowned into silence. Maggie waited until after Fee had done her nightly rounds,
Then she wriggled through the open window and made off across the backyard. She knew where Frank would be, up in the hay in the barn, safe from prying eyes and his father. "Frank, where are you?" she said in a stage whisper as she shuffled into the stilly blackness of the barn, her toes exploring the unknown ground in front of her as sensitively as an animal. "Over here, Meggie," came his tired voice, hardly Frank's voice at all, no life or passion to it. She followed the sound to where he was stretched out in the hay, and snuggled down beside him with her arms as far around his chest as they would reach. "Oh, Frank, I'm so glad you're back," she said. He groaned, slid down in the straw until he was lower than she, and put his head on her body. Meggie clutched at his thick, straight hair, crooning. It was too dark to see her, and the invisible substance of her sympathy undid him. He began to weep, knotting his body into slow, twisting rails of pain, his tears soaking her nightgown. Meggie did not weep. Something in her little soul was old enough and woman enough to feel the irresistible stinging joy of being needed. She sat rocking his head back and forth, until his grief expended itself in emptiness. Section 2, 1921 to 1928. Rafe. Chapter 3. The road to Drogheda brought back no memories of his youth, thought Father Rafe de Bricassat, eyes half shut against the glare, as his new Daimler bounced along in the rutted wheel tracks that marched through the long silver grass. No lovely misty green Ireland, this. And Drogheda? No battlefield, no high seat of power. Or was that strictly true? Better disciplined these days, but acute as ever, his sense of humor conjured in his mind an image of a Cromwellian Mary Carson, dealing out her particular brand of imperial malevolence. Not such a high-flown comparison either. The lady surely wielded as much power and controlled as many individuals as any puissant warlord of elder days. The last gate loomed up through a stand of box and stringy bark. The car came to a throbbing halt. Clapping a disreputable grey broad-brimmed hat on his head to ward off the sun, Father Rafe got out, plodded to the steel bolt on the wooden strut, pulled it back and flung the gate open with weary impatience. There were 27 gates between the presbytery in Gillenbone and Drogheda homestead, each one meaning he had to stop, get out of the car, open the gate, get into the car and drive it through, stop, get out, go back to close the gate, then get in the car again and proceed to the next one. Many and many a time he longed to dispense with at least half the ritual, scoot on down the track, leaving the gates open like a series of astonished mouths behind him. But even the awesome aura of his calling would not prevent the owners of the gates from tarring and feathering him for it. He wished horses were as fast and efficient as cars, because one could open and close gates from the back of a horse without dismounting. "Nothing is given without a disadvantage in it," he said, patting the dashboard of the new Daimler and starting off down the last mile of the grassy, treeless home paddock, the gate firmly bolted behind him. Even to an Irishman used to castles and mansions, this Australian homestead was imposing. Drogheda was the oldest and the biggest property in the district, and had been endowed by its late doting owner with a fitting residence. Built of butter-yellow sandstone blocks hand-hewn in quarries 500 miles eastward, the house had 2 stories and was constructed on austerely Georgian lines, with large, many-paned windows and a wide, iron-pillared veranda running all the way around its bottom story. Gracing the sides of every window were black wooden shutters, not merely ornamental but useful. In the heat of summer they were pulled closed to keep the interior cool. Though it was autumn now and the spindling vine was green, in spring the wisteria, which had been planted the day the house was finished 50 years before, was a solid mass of lilac blooms, rioting all over the outer walls and the veranda roof. Several acres of meticulously scythed lawn surrounded the house, strewn with formal gardens, even now full of color from roses, wallflowers, dahlias, and marigolds. A stand of magnificent ghost gums with pallid white trunks and drifting thin leaves hanging 70 feet above the ground shaded the house from the pitiless sun, their branches wreathed in brilliant magenta, where bougainvillea vines grew intertwined with them. Even those indispensable outback monstrosities, the water tanks, were thickly clothed in hardy native vines, roses and wisteria, and thus managed to look more decorative than functional. Thanks to the late Michael Carson's passion for Drogheda homestead, he had been lavish in the matter of water tanks. Rumour had it Drogheda could afford to keep its lawns green and its flower beds blooming, though no rain fell in 10 years. As one approached down the home paddock, the house and its ghost gums took the eye first, but then one was aware of many other yellow sandstone houses of one story behind it, and to each side, interlocking with the main structure by means of roofed ramps, smothered in creepers. A wide gravel driveway succeeded the wheel ruts of the track, curving to a circular parking area at one side of the big house, but also continuing beyond it, and out of sight down to where the real business of Drogheda lay. The stockyards, the shearing shed, the barns. Privately, Father Rafe preferred the giant pepper trees which shaded all these outbuildings and their attendant activities to the ghost gums of the main house. Pepper trees were dense with pale green fronds and alive with the sound of bees, just the right lazy sort of foliage for an outback station. As Father Rafe parked his car and walked across the lawn, the maid waited on the front veranda, her freckled face wreathed in smiles. "Good morning, Minnie," he said.
"Oh, Father, happy it is to see you this fine dear morning," she said, in her strong brogue, one hand holding the door wide and the other outstretched to receive his battered unclerical hat. Inside the dim hall, with its marble tiles and great brass-railed staircase, he paused until Minnie gave him a nod before entering the drawing-room. Mary Carson was sitting in her wing chair by an open window which extended 15 feet from floor to ceiling, apparently indifferent to the cold air flooding in. Her shock of red hair was almost as bright as it had been in her youth, though the coarse freckled skin had picked up additional splotches from age. For a woman of 65, she had few wrinkles, rather a fine network of tiny diamond-shaped cushions, like a quilted bedspread. The only clues to her intractable nature lay in the 2 deep fissures which ran one on either side of her Roman nose, to end pulling down the corners of her mouth, and in the stony look of the pale blue eyes. Father Rafe crossed the Aubusson carpet silently and kissed her hands. The gesture sat well on a man as tall and graceful as he was, especially since he wore a plain black soutane, which gave him something of a courtly air. Her expressionless eyes suddenly coy and sparkling, Mary Carson almost simpered. "Will you have tea, Father?" she asked. "It depends on whether you wish to hear Mass," he said, sitting down in the chair facing hers and crossing his legs, the soutane riding up sufficiently to show that under it he wore breeches and knee-high boots, a concession to the locale of his parish. "I've brought you communion, but if you'd like to hear Mass, I can be ready to say it in a very few minutes. I don't mind continuing my fast a little longer." "You're too good to me, Father," she said smugly, knowing perfectly well that he, along with everybody else, did homage not to her, but to her money. "Please have tea," she went on. "I'm quite happy with communion." He kept his resentment from showing in his face. This parish had been excellent for his self-control. If once he was offered the chance to rise out of the obscurity his temper had landed him in, he would not again make the same mistake. And if he played his cards well, this old woman might be the answer to his prayers. "I must confess, Father, that this past year has been very pleasant," she said. "You're a far more satisfactory shepherd than old Father Kelly was, God rot his soul." Her voice on the last phrase was suddenly harsh, vindictive. His eyes lifted to her face, twinkling. "My dear Mrs. Carson, that's not a very Catholic sentiment. But the truth, he was a drunken old sot, and I'm quite sure God will rot his soul as much as the drink rotted his body." She leaned forward. "I know you fairly well by this time. I think I'm entitled to ask you a few questions, don't you? After all, you feel free to use Drogheda as your private playground, off learning how to be a stockman, polishing your riding, escaping from the vicissitudes of life in Gilly. All at my invitation, of course. But I do think I'm entitled to some answers, don't you?"
He didn't like to be reminded that he ought to feel grateful, but he had been waiting for the day when she would think she owned him enough to begin demanding things of him. "Indeed you are, Mrs. Carson. I can't thank you enough for permitting me the run of Drogheda, and for all your gifts, my horses, my car." "How old are you?" she asked without further preamble. 28, he replied. "Younger than I thought. Even so, they don't send priests like you to places like Gilly. What did you do to make them send someone like you out here into the back of beyond?" "I insulted the bishop," he said calmly, smiling. "You must have, but I can't think a priest of your peculiar talents can be happy in a place like Gillinbone." "It is God's will." "Stuff and nonsense. You're here because of human failings, your own and the bishop's. Only the Pope is infallible. You're utterly out of your natural element in Gilly. We all know that. Not that we're not grateful to have someone like you for a change, instead of the ordained remittance men they send us usually. But your natural element lies in some corridor of ecclesiastical power, not here among horses and sheep. You'd look magnificent in Cardinal's red." "No chance of that, I'm afraid. I fancy Gillinbone is not exactly the epicenter of the Archbishop Papal Legate's map. And it could be worse. I have you, and I have Drogheda." She accepted the deliberately blatant flattery in the spirit in which it was intended, enjoying his beauty, his attentiveness, his barbed and subtle mind. Truly, he would make a magnificent cardinal. In all her life she could not remember seeing a better-looking man, nor one who used his beauty in quite the same way. He had to be aware of how he looked, the height and the perfect proportions of his body, the fine aristocratic features, the way every physical element had been put together with a degree of care about the appearance of the finished product God lavished on few of his creations. From the loose black curls of his head and the startling blue of his eyes to the small, slender hands and feet, he was perfect. Yes, he had to be conscious of what he was, and yet there was an aloofness about him, a way he had of making her feel he had never been enslaved by his beauty, nor ever would be. He would use it to get what he wanted without compunction, if it would help, but not as though he was enamored of it, rather as if he deemed people beneath contempt for being influenced by it. And she would have given much to know what in his past life had made him so. Curious how many priests were handsome as Adonis, had the sexual magnetism of Don Juan. Did they espouse celibacy as a refuge from the consequences? "Why do you put up with Gillinbone?" she asked. "Why not leave the priesthood rather than put up with it? You could be rich and powerful in any one of a number of fields with your talents, and you can't tell me the thought of power at least doesn't appeal to you." His left eyebrow flew up. "My dear Mrs. Carson, you're a Catholic. You know my vows are sacred. Until my death I remain a priest. I cannot deny it." She snorted with laughter. "Oh, come now. Do you really believe that if you renounced your vows, they'd come after you with everything from bolts of lightning to bloodhounds and shotguns?" "Of course not. Nor do I believe you're stupid enough to think fear of retribution is what keeps me within the priestly fold." "Oh-ho! Waspish, Father de Bricassart. Then what does keep you tied? What compels you to suffer the dust, the heat, and the gilly flies? For all you know, it might be a life sentence." A shadow momentarily dimmed the blue eyes, but he smiled, pitying her. "You're a great comfort, aren't you?" His lips parted. He looked toward the ceiling and sighed. "I was brought up from my cradle to be a priest, but it's far more than that. How can I explain it to a woman? I am a vessel, Mrs. Carson, and at times I'm filled with God. If I were a better priest, there would be no periods of emptiness at all. And that filling, that oneness with God, isn't a function of place. Whether I'm in Gillinbone or a bishop's palace, it occurs. But to define it is difficult, because even to priests it's a great mystery, a divine possession which other men can never know. That's it, perhaps." "Abandon it." I couldn't. So, it's a power, is it? Why should it be given to priests, then? What makes you think the mere smearing of chrism during an exhaustingly long ceremony is able to endow any man with it? He shook his head. Look, it's years of life, even before getting to the point of ordination. The careful development of a state of mind which opens the vessel to God. It's earned. Every day it's earned. Which is the purpose of the vows, don't you see? That no earthly things come between the priest and his state of mind. Not love of a woman, nor love of money, nor unwillingness to obey the dictates of other men. Poverty is nothing new to me. I don't come from a rich family. Chastity I accept without finding it difficult to maintain. And obedience. For me it's the hardest of the three. But I obey, because if I hold myself more important than my function as a receptacle for God, I'm lost. I obey, and if necessary, I'm willing to endure gill and bone as a life sentence. Then you're a fool, she said. I too think that there are more important things than lovers, but being a receptacle for God isn't one of them. Odd. I never realized you believed in God so ardently. I thought you were perhaps a man who doubted. I do doubt. What thinking man doesn't? That's why at times I'm empty. He looked beyond her, at something she couldn't see. Do you know, I think I'd give up every ambition, every desire in me, for the chance to be a perfect priest. Perfection in anything, she said, is unbearably dull. Myself, I prefer a touch of imperfection. He laughed, looking at her in admiration tinged with envy. She was a remarkable woman. Her widowhood was 33 years old, and her only child, a son, had died in infancy. Because of her peculiar status in the gill and bone community, she had not availed herself of any of the overtures made to her by the more ambitious males of her acquaintance. As Michael Carson's widow, she was indisputably a queen, but as someone's wife, she passed control of all she had to that someone. Not Mary Carson's idea of living, to play second fiddle. So she had abjured the flesh, preferring to wield power. It was inconceivable that she should take a lover, for when it came to gossip, gill and bone was as receptive as a wire to an electrical current. To prove herself human and weak was not a part of her obsession. But now she was old enough to be officially beyond the drives of the body. If the new young priest was assiduous in his duties to her, and she rewarded him with little gifts like a car, it was not at all incongruous. A staunch pillar of the church all her life, she had supported her parish and its spiritual leader in fitting fashion, even when Father Kelly had hiccuped his way through the Mass. She was not alone in feeling charitably inclined toward Father Kelly's successor. Father Rafe de Bricassart was deservedly popular with every member of his flock, rich or poor. If his more remote parishioners could not get into Gilly to see him, he went to them, and until Mary Carson had given him his car, he had gone on horseback. His patience and kindness had brought him liking from all and sincere love from some. Martin King of Bugella had expensively refurnished the presbytery. Dominic O'Rourke of Dibben paid the salary of a good housekeeper. So, from the pedestal of her age and her position, Mary Carson felt quite safe in enjoying Father Rafe. She liked matching her wits against a brain as intelligent as her own. She liked outguessing him because she was never sure she actually did outguess him. Getting back to what you were saying about Gilly not being the epicenter of the Archbishop Papal Legate's map, she said, settling deeply into her chair. What do you think would shake that reverend gentleman sufficiently to make Gilly the pivot of his world? The priest smiled ruefully. Impossible to say. A coup of some sort? The sudden saving of 1,000 souls? A sudden capacity to heal the lame and the blind? But the age of miracles is past. Oh, come now, I doubt that. It's just that he's altered his technique. These days he uses money. What a cynic you are. Maybe that's why I like you so much, Mrs. Carson. My name is Mary. Please, call me Mary. Minnie came in wheeling the tea trolley as Father de Bricassart said, Thank you, Mary. Over fresh bannocks and anchovies on toast, Mary Carson sighed. Dear Father. I want you to pray especially hard for me this morning."
"Call me Wraith," he said, then went on mischievously. "I doubt it's possible for me to pray any harder for you than I normally do, but I'll try."
"Oh, you're a charmer!" Or was that remark innuendo? I don't usually care for obviousness, but with you I'm never sure if the obviousness isn't actually a cloak for something deeper, like a carrot before a donkey. Just what do you really think of me, Father de Bricquissart? I'll never know, because you'll never be tactless enough to tell me. Will you? Fascinating, fascinating. But you must pray for me. I'm old and I've sinned much."
"Age creeps on us all, and I too have sinned."
A dry chuckle escaped her. "I'd give a lot to know how you've sinned. Indeed, indeed, I would." She was silent for a moment, then changed the subject. "At this minute I'm minus a head stockman."
"Again?"
"5 in the past year. It's getting hard to find a decent man."
"Well, rumour hath it, you're not exactly a generous or a considerate employer."
"Oh, impudent!" she gasped, laughing. "Who bought you a brand-new Daimler so you wouldn't have to ride?"
"Ah, but look how hard I pray for you."
"If Michael had only had half your wit and character, I might have loved him," she said abruptly. Her face changed, became spiteful. 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 "Do you think I'm without a relative in the world and must leave my money and my land to Mother Church? Is that it?"
"I have no idea,"
he said tranquilly, pouring himself more tea. "As a matter of fact, I have a brother with a large and thriving family of sons."
"How nice for you," he said demurely.
"When I married, I was quite without worldly goods. I knew I'd never marry well in Ireland, where a woman has to have breeding and background to catch a rich husband. So I worked my fingers to the bone to save my passage money, to a land where the rich men aren't so fussy. All I had when I got here were a face and a figure and a better brain than women are supposed to have. And they were adequate to catch Michael Carson, who was a rich fool. He doted on me until the day he died."
"And your brother?" he prompted, thinking she was going off at a tangent.
"My brother is 11 years younger than I am, which would make him 54 now."
"We're the only two still alive."
"I hardly know him. He was a small child when I left Galway. At present he lives in New Zealand, though if he emigrated to make his fortune, he hasn't succeeded. But last night when the station hand brought me the news that Arthur Teviot had packed his traps and gone, I suddenly thought of Patrick. Here I am, not getting any younger, with no family around me, and it occurred to me that Paddy is an experienced man of the land, without the means to own land. Why not, I thought, write to him and ask him to bring himself and his sons here. When I die, he'll inherit Drogheda and Mitcher Limited, and he's my only living relative closer than some unknown cousins back in Ireland." She smiled. "It seems silly to wait, doesn't it? He might as well come now as later. Get used to running sheep on the black soil plains, which I'm sure is quite different from sheep in New Zealand. Then when I'm gone, he can step into my shoes without feeling the pinch."
Head lowered, she watched Father Rafe closely. "I wonder you didn't think of it earlier," he said.
"Oh, I did. But until recently I thought the last thing I wanted was a lot of vultures waiting anxiously for me to breathe my last. Only lately, the day of my demise seems a lot closer than it used to, and I feel, I don't know, as if it might be nice to be surrounded by people of my own flesh and blood."
"What's the matter? Do you think you're ill?" he asked quickly, a real concern in his eyes.
She shrugged. "I'm perfectly all right. Yet there's something ominous about turning 65. Suddenly old age is not a phenomenon which will occur. It has occurred."
"I see what you mean, and you're right. It will be very pleasant for you, hearing young voices in the house."
"Oh, they won't live here," she said. "They can live in the head stockman's house down by the creek, well away from me. I'm not fond of children or their voices."
"Isn't that a rather shabby way to treat your only brother, Mary? Even if your ages are so disparate."
"He'll inherit. Let him earn it," she said crudely.
Fiona Cleary was delivered of another boy 6 days before Maggie's 9th birthday, Counting herself lucky, nothing but a couple of miscarriages had happened in the interim. At 9, Meggie was old enough to be a real help. Fee herself was 40 years old, too old to bear children without a great deal of strength-sapping pain. The child, named Harold, was a delicate baby. For the first time anyone could ever remember, the doctor came regularly to the house. And as troubles do, the Cleary troubles multiplied. The aftermath of the war was not a boom, but a rural depression. Work became increasingly harder to get. Old Angus McWhirter delivered a telegram to the house one day, just as they were finishing tea, and Paddy tore it open with trembling hands. Telegrams never held good news. The boys gathered round, all save Frank, who took his cup of tea and left the table. Fee's eyes followed him, then turned back as Paddy groaned. "What is it?" she asked. Paddy was staring at the piece of paper as if it held news of a death. "Archibald doesn't want us." Bob pounded his fist on the table savagely. He had been so looking forward to going with his father as an apprentice shearer, and Archibald's was to have been his first pen. "Why should he do a dirty thing like this to us, Daddy? We were due to start there tomorrow." "He doesn't say why, Bob. I suppose some scab contractor undercut me." "Oh, Paddy," Fee sighed. Baby Hal began to cry from the big bassinet by the stove, but before Fee could move, Meggie was up. Frank had come back inside the door and was standing, tea in hand, watching his father narrowly. "Well, I suppose I'll have to go and see Archibald," Paddy said at last. "It's too late now to look for another shed to replace his, but I do think he owes me a better explanation than this. We'll just have to hope we can find work milking until Willoughby's shed starts in July." Meggie pulled a square of white towel from the huge pile sitting by the stove warming, and spread it carefully on the work-table, then lifted the crying child out of the wicker crib. The Cleary hair glittered sparsely on his little skull as Meggie changed his diaper swiftly and as efficiently as her mother could have done. "Little Mother Meggie," Frank said to tease her. "I'm not," she answered indignantly. "I'm just helping Mum." "I know," he said gently. "You're a good girl, wee Meggie." He tugged at the white taffeta bow on the back of her head until it hung lopsided. Up came the big grey eyes to his face adoringly. Over the nodding head of the baby she might have been his own age, or older. There was a pain in his chest, that this should have fallen upon her at an age when the only baby she ought to be caring for was Agnes, now relegated, forgotten to the bedroom. If it wasn't for her and their mother, he would have been gone long since. He looked at his father sourly, the cause of the new life creating such chaos in the house. Served him right, getting done out of his shed. Somehow the other boys, and even Meggie, had never intruded on his thoughts the way Hal did. But when Fee's waistline began to swell this time, he was old enough himself to be married and a father. Everyone except little Meggie had been uncomfortable about it. His mother especially. The furtive glances of the boys made her shrink like a rabbit. She could not meet Frank's eyes or quench the shame in her own. Nor should any woman go through that, Frank said to himself for the 1,000th time, remembering the horrifying moans and cries which had come from her bedroom the night Hal was born. Of age now, he hadn't been packed off elsewhere like the others. Served Daddy right, losing his shed. A decent man would have left her alone. His mother's head in the new electric light was spun gold, the pure profile as she looked down the long table at Paddy, unspeakably beautiful. How had someone as lovely and refined as she married an itinerant shearer from the bogs of Galway? Wasting herself and her spode china, her damask table napery and her Persian rugs in the parlour, that no one ever saw, because she didn't fit in with the wives of Paddy's peers. She made them too conscious of their vulgar loud voices, their bewilderment when faced with more than one fork. Sometimes on a Sunday she would go into the lonely parlour, sit down at the spinet under the window and play, though her touch had long gone from want of time to practice, and she could no longer manage any but the simplest pieces. He would sit beneath the window among the lilacs and the lilies, and close his eyes to listen. There was a sort of vision he had then, of his mother clad in a long bustled gown of palest pink shadow lace, sitting at the spinet in a huge ivory room, great branches of candles all around her. It would make him long to weep, but he never wept any more, not since that night in the barn after the police had brought him home. Meggie had put Hal back in the bassinet and gone to stand beside her mother.
There was another one wasted. The same proud, sensitive profile. Something of Fiona about her hands, her child's body. She would be very like her mother when she too was a woman. And who would marry her? Another oafish Irish shearer, or a clod-hopping yokel from some wahine dairy farm? She was worth more, but she was not born to more. There was no way out. That was what everyone said, and every year longer that he lived seemed to bear it out. Suddenly conscious of his fixed regard, Fee and Meggie turned together, smiling at him with the peculiar tenderness women save for the most beloved man in their lives. Frank put his cup on the table and went out to feed the dogs, wishing he could weep or commit murder, anything which might banish the pain. 3 days after Paddy lost the Archibald shed, Mary Carson's letter came. He had opened it in the Wahine post office the moment he collected his mail, and came back to the house skipping like a child. "We're going to Australia," he yelled, waving the expensive vellum pages under his family's stunned noses. There was silence, all eyes riveted on him. Fee's eyes were shocked. So were Meggie's, but every male pair had lit with joy. Frank's blazed. "But, Paddy, why should she think of you so suddenly after all these years?" Fee asked, after she had read the letter. "Her money's not new to her, nor is her isolation. I never remember her offering to help us before." "It seems she's frightened of dying alone," he said, as much to reassure himself as Fee. "You saw what she wrote. I am not young, and you and your boys are my heirs. I think we ought to see each other before I die, and it's time you learned how to run your inheritance. I have the intention of making you my head stockman. It will be excellent training, and those of your boys who are old enough to work may have employment as stockmen also. Drogheda will become a family concern, run by the family without help from outsiders." "Does she say anything about sending us the money to get to Australia?" Fee asked. Paddy's back stiffened. "I wouldn't dream of dunning her for that," he snapped. "We can get to Australia without begging from her. I have enough put by." "I think she ought to pay our way," Fee maintained stubbornly, and to everyone's shocked surprise. She did not often voice an opinion. "Why should you give up your life here and go off to work for her on the strength of a promise given in a letter? She's never lifted a finger to help us before, and I don't trust her. All I ever remember you saying about her was that she had the tightest clutch on a pound you'd ever seen. After all, Paddy, it's not as if you know her so very well. There was such a big gap between you in age, and she went to Australia before you were old enough to start school." "I don't see how that alters things now, and if she is tight-fisted, all the more for us to inherit. No, Fee, we're going to Australia, and we'll pay our own way there." Fee said no more. It was impossible to tell from her face whether she resented being so summarily dismissed. "Hooray, we're going to Australia!" Bob shouted, grabbing at his father's shoulder. Jack, Hughie, and Stu jigged up and down, and Frank was smiling, his eyes seeing nothing in the room but something far beyond it. Only Fee and Meggie wondered and feared, hoping painfully it would all come to nothing, for their lives could be no easier in Australia, just the same things under strange conditions. "Where's Gill and Bone?" Stuart asked. Out came the old atlas. Poor though the Clearys were, there were several shelves of books behind the kitchen dining table. The boys pored over yellowing pages until they found New South Wales. Used to small New Zealand distances, it didn't occur to them to consult the scale of miles in the bottom left-hand corner. They just naturally assumed New South Wales was the same size as the North Island of New Zealand. And there was Gill and Bone, up toward the top left-hand corner. About the same distance from Sydney as Wanganui was from Auckland, it seemed, although the dots indicating towns were far fewer than on the North Island map. "It's a very old atlas," Paddy said. "Australia is like America, growing in leaps and bounds, and I'm sure there are a lot more towns these days." They would have to go steerage on the ship, but it was only 3 days after all. Not too bad. Not like the weeks and weeks between England and the Antipodes. All they could afford to take with them were clothes, china, cutlery, household linens, cooking utensils, and those shelves of precious books. The furniture would have to be sold to cover the cost of shipping Fee's few bits and pieces in the parlor, her spinet and rugs and chairs. "I won't hear of your leaving them behind," Paddy told Fee firmly. "Are you sure we can afford it?" "Positive. As to the other furniture, Mary says she's readying the head stockman's house and that it's got everything we're likely to be needing.
I'm glad we don't have to live in the same house as Mary.
So am I, said Fee. Paddy went into Wanganui to book them an 8-berth steerage cabin on the Wahine. Strange that the ship and their nearest town should have the same name. They were due to sail at the end of August, so by the beginning of that month everyone started realizing the big adventure was actually going to happen. The dogs had to be given away, the horses and the buggy sold, the furniture loaded onto old Angus McWhirter's dray and taken into Wanganui for auction. These few pieces crated along with the china and linen and books and kitchen goods. Frank found his mother standing by the beautiful old spinet, stroking its faintly pink, streaky paneling, and looking vaguely at the powdering of gold dust on her fingertips. "Did you always have it, Mum?" he asked. "Yes. What was actually mine they couldn't take from me when I married. The spinet, the Persian carpets, the Louis XV sofa and chairs, the Regency escritoire. Not much, but they were rightfully mine." The grey, wistful eyes stared past his shoulder at the oil painting on the wall behind him, dimmed with age a little, but still showing clearly the golden-haired woman in her pale pink lace gown, crinolined with 107 flounces. "Who was she?" he asked curiously, turning his head. "I've always wanted to know." "A great lady." "Well, she's got to be related to you. She looks like you a bit." "Her? A relation of mine." The eyes left their contemplation of the picture and rested on her son's face ironically. "Now, do I look as if I could ever have had a relative like her?" "Yes." "You've cobwebs in your brain. Brush them out." "I wish you'd tell me, Mum." She sighed and shut the spinet, dusting the gold off her fingers. "There's nothing to tell. Nothing at all. Come on, help me move these things into the middle of the room so Daddy can pack them." The voyage was a nightmare. Before the Wahine was out of Wellington Harbour, they were all seasick, and they continued to be seasick all the way across 1,200 miles of gale-stirred wintry seas. Paddy took the boys up on deck and kept them there, in spite of the bitter wind and constant spray, only going below to see his women and baby when some kind soul volunteered to keep an eye on his 4 miserable, retching boys. Much though he yearned for fresh air, Frank had elected to remain below to guard the women. The cabin was tiny, stifling, and reeked of oil, for it was below the waterline and toward the bows, where the ship's motion was most violent. Some hours out of Wellington, Frank and Meggie became convinced their mother was going to die. The doctor, summoned from first class by a very worried steward, shook his head over her pessimistically. "Just as well it's only a short voyage," he said, instructing his nurse to find milk for the baby. Between bouts of retching, Frank and Meggie managed to bottle-feed Hal, who didn't take to it kindly. Fee had stopped trying to vomit and had sunk into a kind of coma from which they could not rouse her. The steward helped Frank put her in the top bunk where the air was a little less stale, and holding a towel to his mouth to stem the watery bile he still brought up, Frank perched himself on the edge beside her, stroking the matted yellow hair back from her brow. Hour after hour he stuck to his post in spite of his own sickness. Every time Paddy came in, he was with his mother, stroking her hair, while Meggie huddled on a lower berth with Hal, a towel to her mouth. 3 hours out of Sydney, the seas dropped to a glassy calm, and fog stole in furtively from the far Antarctic, wrapping itself about the old ship. Meggie, reviving a little, imagined it bellowed regularly in pain now the terrible buffeting was over. They inched through the gluey grayness as stealthily as a hunted thing, until that deep, monotonous bawl sounded again from somewhere on the superstructure, a lost and lonely, indescribably sad sound. Then all around them the air was filled with mournful bellows as they slipped through ghostly, smoking water into the harbour. Meggie never forgot the sound of foghorns, her first introduction to Australia. Paddy carried Fee off the Wahine in his arms, Frank following with the baby, Meggie with a case, each of the boys stumbling wearily under some kind of burden. They had come into Pyrmont, a meaningless name, on a foggy winter morning at the end of August 1921. An enormous line of taxis waited outside the iron shed on the wharf. Meggie gaped round-eyed, for she had never seen so many cars in one place at one time. Somehow Paddy packed them all into a single cab, its driver volunteering to take them to the People's Palace,
"That's the place for yous, mate," he told Paddy. "It's a hotel for the working man run by the Sallys." The streets were thronged with cars, seeming to rush in all directions. There were very few horses. They stared raptly out of the taxi windows at the tall brick buildings, the narrow winding streets, the rapidity with which crowds of people seemed to merge and dissolve in some strange urban ritual. Wellington had awed them, but Sydney made Wellington look like a small country town. While Fee rested in one of the myriad rooms of the Warren the Salvation Army fondly called the People's Palace, Paddy went off to Central Railway Station to see when they could get a train for Gillinbone. Quite recovered, the boys clamoured to go with him, but they had been told it was not very far, and that the way was all shops, including one which sold squill candy. Envying their youth, Paddy yielded, for he wasn't sure how strong his own legs were after 3 days of seasickness. Frank and Meggie stayed with Fee and the baby, longing to go too, but more concerned that their mother be better. Indeed, she seemed to gain strength rapidly once off the ship, and had drunk a bowl of soup and nibbled a slice of toast brought to her by one of the working man's bonneted angels. "If we don't go tonight, Fee, it's a week until the next through train," Paddy said when he returned. "Do you think you could manage the journey tonight?" Fee sat up shivering. "I can manage." "I think we ought to wait," Frank said heartily. "I don't think Mum's well enough to travel." "Well, you don't seem to understand, Frank, that if we miss tonight's train we have to wait a whole week, and I just don't have the price of a week's stay in Sydney in my pocket. This is a big country, and where we're going isn't served by a daily train. We could get as far as Dubbo on any one of 3 trains tomorrow, but then we'd have to wait for a local connection, and they told me we'd suffer a lot more travelling that way than if we make the effort to catch tonight's express." "I'll manage, Paddy," Fee repeated. "I've got Frank and Meggie. I'll be all right." Her eyes were on Frank, pleading for his silence. "Then I'll send Mary a telegram now, telling her to expect us tomorrow night." Central Station was bigger than any building the Clearys had ever been inside. A vast glass cylinder which seemed simultaneously to echo and absorb the din of thousands of people waiting beside battered, strapped suitcases and fixedly watching a giant indicator board which men with long poles altered by hand. In the gathering evening darkness they found themselves a part of the throng, their eyes on the steel concertina gates of Platform 5. Though shut, they bore a large hand-painted sign saying, "Gillinbone Mail." On Platform 1 and Platform 2, a terrific activity heralded the imminent departure of the Brisbane and Melbourne night expresses, passengers crowding through the barriers. Soon it was their turn, as the gates of Platform 5 squashed themselves open and the people began eagerly to move. Paddy found them an empty second-class compartment, put the older boys by the windows, and Fee, Meggie, and the baby by the sliding doors which led into the long corridor connecting compartments. Faces would peer in hopefully in sight of a spare seat, to vanish horrified at the sight of so many young children. Sometimes being a large family was an advantage. The night was cold enough to warrant unstrapping of the big tartan travelling rugs. All of the suitcases bore on their outsides. Though the carriage was not heated, steel boxes full of hot ashes lay along the floor, radiating warmth. And no one had expected heating anyway, because nothing in Australia or New Zealand was ever heated. "How far is it, Daddy?" Meggie asked as the train drew out, clanking and rocking gently across an eternity of points. "A long way further than it looked on our atlas, Meggie. 610 miles. We'll be there late tomorrow afternoon." The boys gasped, but forgot it at the blossoming of a fairyland of lights outside. Everyone clustered at the windows and watched while the first miles flew by, and still the houses did not diminish. The speed increased, the lights grew scattered and finally went out, replaced by a constant flurry of sparks streaming past in a howling wind. When Paddy took the boys outside so Fee could feed Hal, Meggie gazed after them longingly. These days it seemed she was not to be included as one of the boys, not since the baby had disrupted her life and chained her to the house as firmly as her mother was. Not that she really minded, she told herself loyally. He was such a dear little fellow, the chief delight of her life, and it was nice to have Mum treat her as another grown-up lady. What caused Mum to grow babies she had no idea, but the result was lovely. She gave Hal to Fee. The train stopped not long after, creaking and squealing, and seemed to stand hours panting for breath. She was dying to open the window and look out, but the compartment was growing very cold in spite of the hot ashes on the floor. Paddy came in from the corridor with a steaming cup of tea for Fee, who put Hal back on the seat, glutted and sleepy.
"What is it?" she asked.
"A place called Valley Heights. We take on another engine here for the climb to Lithgow," the girl in the refreshment room said.
"How long have I got to drink this?"
15 minutes. Frank's getting you some sandwiches, and I'll see the boys are fed. Our next refreshment stop is a place called Blaney, much later in the night."
Meggie shared her mother's cup of hot sugary tea, suddenly unbearably excited, and gobbled her sandwich when Frank brought it. He settled her on the long seat below baby Hal, tucked a rug firmly around her, and then did the same for Fee, stretched out full length on the seat opposite. Stuart and Hughie were bedded down on the floor between the seats, but Paddy told Fee that he was taking Bob, Frank, and Jack several compartments down to talk to some shearers, and would spend the night there. It was much nicer than the ship, clicking along to the rhythmic huff-a-huff of the two engines, listening to the wind in the telegraph wires, the occasional flurry of furious huffs as steel wheels slipped on sloping steel rails, frantically sought traction. Meggie went to sleep. In the morning they stared, awed and dismayed, at a landscape so alien they had not dreamed anything like it existed on the same planet as New Zealand. The rolling hills were there, certainly, but absolutely nothing else reminiscent of home. It was all brown and grey, even the trees. The winter wheat was already turned a faunish silver by the glaring sun, miles upon miles of it rippling and bending in the wind, broken only by stands of thin, spindling, blue-leafed trees and dusty clumps of tired grey bushes. Fee's stoical eyes surveyed the scene without changing expression, but poor Meggie's were full of tears. It was horrible, fenceless, and vast, without a trace of green. From freezing night it turned to scorching day as the sun climbed toward its zenith, and the train racketed on and on and on, stopping occasionally in some tiny town full of bicycles and horse-drawn vehicles. Cars were scarce out here, it seemed. Paddy opened both the windows all the way in spite of the soot which swirled in and settled on everything. It was so hot they were gasping, their heavy New Zealand winter clothing sticking and itching. It did not seem possible that anywhere outside of hell could be so hot in winter. Gillenbone came with the dying sun, a strange small collection of ramshackle wooden and corrugated iron buildings along either side of one dusty, wide street, treeless and tired. The melting sun had licked a golden paste over everything and gave the town a transient gilded dignity, which faded even as they stood on the platform watching. It became once more a typical settlement on the very edge of the back of beyond, a last outpost in a steadily diminishing rainfall belt. Not far away westward began 2,000 miles of the never-never, the desert lands where it could not rain. A resplendent black car was standing in the station yard, and striding unconcernedly toward them through the inches-deep dust came a priest. His long soutane made him seem a figure out of the past, as if he did not move on feet like ordinary men, but drifted dreamlike. The dust rose and billowed around him, red in the last of the sunset. "Hello, I'm Father de Bricassart," he said, holding out his hand to Paddy. "You have to be Mary's brother. You're the living image of her." He turned to Fee and lifted her limp hand to his lips, smiling in genuine astonishment. No one could spot a gentlewoman quicker than Father Rafe. "Why, you're beautiful," he said, as if it were the most natural remark in the world for a priest to make. And then his eyes went onward to the boys, standing together in a huddle. They rested for a moment with puzzled bewilderment on Frank, who had charge of the baby, and ticked off each boy as they got smaller and smaller. Behind them, all by herself, Meggie stood gaping up at him, with her mouth open, as if she were looking at God. Without seeming to notice how his fine serge robe wallowed in the dust, he stepped past the boys and squatted down to hold Meggie between his hands, and they were firm, gentle, kind. "Well, and who are you?" he asked her, smiling. "Meggie," she said.
"Her name's Megan." Frank scowled, hating this beautiful man, his stunning height. "My favorite name, Megan." He straightened but held Maggie's hand in his. "It will be better for you to stay at the presbytery tonight," he said, leading Meggie toward the car. "I'll drive you out to Drogheda in the morning. It's too far after the train ride from Sydney."
Aside from the Hotel Imperial, the Catholic Church, school, convent, and presbytery were the only brick edifices in Gillinbone, even the big public school having to content itself with timber frame. Now that darkness had fallen, the air had grown incredibly chill, but in the presbytery lounge a huge log fire was blazing, and the smell of food came tantalizingly from somewhere beyond. The housekeeper, a wizened old Scotswoman with amazing energy, bustled about showing them their rooms, chattering all the while in a broad Western Highlands accent. Used to the touch-me-not reserve of the Wahine priests, the Clearys found it hard to cope with Father Rafe's easy, cheerful bonhomie. Only Paddy thawed, for he could remember the friendliness of the priests in his native Galway, their closeness to lesser beings. The rest ate their supper in careful silence, and escaped upstairs as soon as they could, Paddy reluctantly following. To him, his religion was a warmth and a consolation, but to the rest of his family it was something rooted in fear, a do-it-or-thou-shalt-be-damned compulsion. When they had gone, Father Rafe stretched out in his favorite chair, staring at the fire, smoking a cigarette and smiling. In his mind's eye he was passing the Clearys in review, as he had first seen them from the station yard. The man so like Mary, but bowed with hard work, and very obviously not of her malicious disposition. His weary, beautiful wife, who looked as if she ought to have descended from a landaulette drawn by matched white horses. Dark and surly Frank with black eyes. Black eyes. The sons, most of them like their father, but the youngest one, Stuart, very like his mother. He'd be a handsome man when he grew up. Impossible to tell what the baby would become. And Meggie, the sweetest, the most adorable little girl he had ever seen. Hair of a color which defied description, not red and not gold, a perfect fusion of both, and looking up at him with silver-grey eyes of such a lambent purity, like melted jewels. Shrugging, he threw the cigarette stub into the fire and got to his feet. He was getting fanciful in his old age. Melted jewels, indeed. More likely his own eyes were coming down with the sandy blight. In the morning he drove his overnight guests to Drogheda, so inured by now to the landscape that he derived great amusement from their comments. The last hill lay 200 miles to the east. This was the land of the black soil plains, he explained. Just sweeping, lightly timbered grasslands, as flat as a board. The day was as hot as the previous one, but the Daimler was a great deal more comfortable to travel in than the train had been. And they had started out early, fasting Father Rafe's vestments and the Blessed Sacrament, packed carefully in a black case. "The sheep are dirty," said Meggie dolefully, gazing at the many hundreds of rusty red bundles with their questing noses down into the grass. "Ah, I can see I ought to have chosen New Zealand," the priest said. "It must be like Ireland, then, and have nice cream sheep." "Yes, it is like Ireland in many ways. It has the same beautiful green grass, but it's wilder, a lot less tamed," Paddy answered. He liked Father Rafe very much. Just then a group of emus lurched to their feet and commenced to run, fleet as the wind, their ungainly legs a blur, their long necks stretched out. The children gasped and burst out laughing, enchanted at seeing giant birds which ran instead of flying. "What a pleasure it is not to have to get out and open these wretched gates," Father Rafe said as the last one was shut behind them, and Bob, who had done gate duty for him, scrambled back into the car. After the shocks Australia had administered to them in bewildering rapidity, Drogheda homestead seemed like a touch of home, with its gracious Georgian facade, and its budding wisteria vines, its thousands of rose bushes. "Are we going to live here?" Meggie squeaked. "Not exactly," the priest said quickly. "The house you're going to live in is about a mile further on, down by the creek." Mary Carson was waiting to receive them in the vast drawing-room, and did not rise to greet her brother, but forced him to come to her as she sat in her wing chair. "Well, Paddy," she said pleasantly enough, looking past him fixedly, to where Father Rafe stood with Meggie in his arms, and her little arms locked tightly about his neck. Mary Carson got up ponderously, without greeting Fee or the children. "Let us hear Mass immediately," she said. "I'm sure Father de Bricassard is anxious to be on his way." "Not at all, my dear Mary." He laughed, blue eyes gleaming. "I shall say Mass. We'll all have a good hot breakfast at your table, and then I promised Meggie I'll show her where she's going to live." "Meggie," said Mary Carson. "Yes, this is Meggie.
which rather begins the introductions at the tail, doesn't it? Let me begin at the head, Mary, please. This is Fiona."
Mary Carson nodded curtly and paid scant attention as Father Rafe ran through the boys. She was too busy watching the priest and Maggie. Chapter 4. The head stockman's house stood on piles some 30 feet above a narrow gulch fringed with tall, straggling gum trees and many weeping willows. After the splendor of Drogheda homestead, it was rather bare and utilitarian, but in its appurtenances it was not unlike the house they had left behind in New Zealand. Solid Victorian furniture filled the rooms to overflowing, smothered in fine red dust.
"You're lucky here. You have a bathroom," Father Rafe said, as he brought them up the plank steps to the front veranda. It was quite a climb, for the piles upon which the house was poised were 15 feet high. "In case the creek runs a banker," Father Rafe explained. "You're right on it here, and I've heard it can rise 60 feet in a night."
They did indeed have a bathroom. An old tin bath and a chip water heater stood in a walled-off alcove at the end of the back veranda. But as the women found to their disgust, the lavatory was nothing more than a hole in the ground some 200 yards away from the house, and it stank. After New Zealand, primitive. "Whoever lived here wasn't very clean," Fee said as she ran her finger through the dust on the sideboard. Father Rafe laughed. "You'll fight a losing battle trying to get rid of that," he said. "This is the outback, and there are 3 things you'll never defeat: the heat, the dust, and the flies. No matter what you do, they'll always be with you." Fee looked at the priest. "You're very good to us, Father." "And why not? You're the only relatives of my very good friend, Mary Carson." She shrugged, unimpressed. "I'm not used to being on friendly terms with the priest. In New Zealand they kept themselves very much to themselves." "You're not a Catholic, are you?" "No, Paddy's the Catholic. Naturally, the children have been reared as Catholics, every last one of them, if that's what's worrying you." "It never occurred to me. Do you resent it?" "I really don't care one way or the other." "You didn't convert?" "I'm not a hypocrite, Father de Bricassat. I had lost faith in my own church, and I had no wish to espouse a different, equally meaningless creed." "I see." He watched Maggie as she stood on the front veranda, peering up the track toward Drogheda Big House. "She's so pretty, your daughter. I have a fondness for Titian hair, you know. Hers would have sent the artist running for his brushes. I've never seen exactly that colour before. Is she your only daughter?" "Yes. Boys run in both Paddy's family and my own. Girls are unusual." "Poor little thing," he said obscurely. After the crates arrived from Sydney and the house took on a more familiar look with its books, china, ornaments, and the parlour filled with Fee's furniture, things began to settle down. Paddy and the boys older than Stu were away most of the time with the 2 station hands Mary Carson had retained to teach them the many differences between sheep in northwest New South Wales and sheep in New Zealand. Fee, Maggie, and Stu discovered the differences between running a house in New Zealand and living in the head stockman's residence on Drogheda. There was a tacit understanding they would never disturb Mary Carson herself, but her housekeeper and her maids were just as eager to help the women as her station hands were to help the men. Drogheda was, everyone learned, a world in itself, so cut off from civilization that after a while even Gill and Bone became no more than a name with remote memories. Within the bounds of the great home paddock lay stables, a smithy, garages, innumerable sheds storing everything from feed to machinery, dog kennels and runs, a labyrinthine maze of stockyards, a mammoth shearing shed with a staggering number of 26 stands in it, and yet another jigsaw puzzle of yards behind it. There were fowl runs, pig pens, cow bales, and a dairy, quarters for the 26 shearers, small shacks for the rouseabouts, 2 other smaller houses like their own for stockmen, a jackaroo's barracks, a slaughter yard, and wood heaps. All this sat in just about the middle of a treeless circle whose diameter measured 3 miles, the home paddock. Only at the point where the head stockman's house lay did the conglomeration of buildings almost touch the forests beyond. However, there were many trees around the sheds, yards, and animal runs to provide welcome and necessary shade, mostly pepper trees, huge, hardy, dense, and sleepily lovely. Beyond, in the long grass of the home paddock, horses and milch cows grazed drowsily.
The deep gully beside the head stockman's house had a shallow, sluggish stream of muddy water at its bottom. No one credited Father Rafe's tale of its rising 60 feet overnight. It didn't seem possible. Water from this creek was pumped up by hand to service the bathroom and kitchen, and it took the women a long time to get used to washing themselves, the dishes, and the clothes in greenish-brown water. 6 massive corrugated iron tanks, perched on wooden derrick-like towers, caught rain from the roof and provided them with drinking water. But they learned they must use it very sparingly, that it was never to be used for washing, for there was no guarantee as to when the next rains might come to fill the tanks up. The sheep and cattle drank artesian water, not tapped from an easily accessible water table, but true artesian water brought from over 3,000 feet below the surface. It gushed at boiling point from a pipe at what was called the bore head, and ran through tiny channels fringed with poisonously green grass to every paddock on the property. These channels were the bore drains, and the heavily sulphureted, mineral-laden water they contained was not fit for human consumption. At first the distances staggered them. Drogheda had 250,000 acres. Its longest boundary stretched for 80 miles. The homestead was 40 miles and 27 gates away from Gillinbone, the only settlement of any kind closer than 106 miles. The narrow eastern boundary was formed by the Part01 River, which was what the locals called this northern course of the Darling River, a great muddy 1,000-mile stream that finally joined the Murray River and surged out into the Southern Ocean 1,500 miles away in South Australia. Gillen Creek, which ran in the gully beside the head stockman's house, merged into the Barwon 2 miles beyond the home paddock. Paddy and the boys loved it. Sometimes they spent days on end in the saddle, miles away from the homestead, camping at night under a sky so vast and filled with stars it seemed they were a part of God. The grey-brown land swarmed with life. Kangaroos in flocks of thousands streamed leaping through the trees, taking fences in their stride, utterly lovely in their grace and freedom in numbers. Emus built their nests in the middle of the grassy plain and stalked like giants about their territorial boundaries, taking fright at anything strange and running fleeter than horses away from their dark green football-sized eggs. Termites built rusty towers like miniature skyscrapers. Huge ants with a savage bite poured in rivers down mounded holes in the ground. The bird life was so rich and varied there seemed no end to new kinds, and they lived not in ones and twos, but in thousands upon thousands. Tiny green and yellow parakeets Fee used to call lovebirds, but which the locals called budgerigars. Scarlet and blue smallish parrots called rosellas. Big pale gray parrots with brilliant purplish-pink breasts, underwings, and heads called galahs, and the great pure white birds with cheeky yellow combs called sulphur-crested cockatoos. Exquisite tiny finches whirred and wheeled, so did sparrows and starlings, and the strong brown kingfishers called kookaburras laughed and chuckled gleefully, or dived for snakes, their favorite food. They were well-nigh human, all these birds, and completely without fear, sitting in hundreds in the trees, peering about with bright, intelligent eyes, screaming, talking, laughing, imitating anything that produced a sound. Fearsome lizards, 5 or 6 feet long, pounded over the ground and leaped lithely for high tree branches, as at home off the earth as on it. They were goannas. And there were many other lizards, smaller, but some no less frightening, adorned with horny triceratopian ruffs about their necks, or with swollen bright blue tongues. Of snakes the variety was almost endless, and the Clearys learned that the biggest and most dangerous-looking were often the most benign, while a stumpy little creature a foot long might be a death adder. Carpet snakes, copper snakes, tree snakes, red-bellied black snakes, brown snakes, lethal tiger snakes. And insects, grasshoppers, locusts, crickets, bees, flies of all sizes and sorts, cicadas, gnats, dragonflies, giant moths, and so many butterflies. The spiders were dreadful, huge hairy things with a leg span of inches, or deceptively small and deadly black things lurking in the lavatory. Some lived in vast wheeling webs slung between trees, some rocked inside dense gossamer cradles hooked among grass blades. Other dived into little holes in the ground complete with lids which shut after them. Predators were there too, wild pigs frightened of nothing, savage and flesh-eating,
black hairy things the size of fully grown cows. Dingoes, the wild native dogs, which slunk close to the ground and blended into the grass. Crows in hundreds, carking desolately from the blasted white skeletons of dead trees. Hawks and eagles hovering motionless on the air currents. From some of these, the sheep and cattle had to be protected, especially when they dropped their young. The kangaroos and rabbits ate the precious grass. The pigs and dingoes ate lambs, calves, and sick animals. The crows pecked out eyes. The Clearys had to learn to shoot, then carried rifles as they rode, sometimes to put a suffering beast out of its misery, sometimes to fell a boar or a dingo. This, thought the boys exultantly, was life. Not one of them yearned for New Zealand. When the flies clustered like syrup in the corners of their eyes, up their noses, in their mouths and ears, they learned the Australian trick and hung corks bobbing from the ends of strings all around the brims of their hats. To prevent crawlies from getting up inside the legs of their baggy trousers, they tied strips of kangaroo hide, called baoyangs, below their knees, giggling at the silly-sounding name, but awed by the necessity. New Zealand was tame compared to this. This was life. Tied to the house and its immediate environs, the women found life much less to their liking, but they had not the leisure or the excuse to ride, nor did they have the stimulation of varying activities. It was just harder to do what women always did: cook, clean, wash, iron, care for babies. They battled the heat, the dust, the flies, the many steps, the muddy water, the nearly perennial absence of men to carry and chop wood, pump water, kill fowls. The heat especially was hard to bear, and it was as yet only early spring. Even so, the thermometer out on the shady veranda reached 100 degrees every day. Inside the kitchen, with the range going, it was 120 degrees. Their many layers of clothing were close-fitting and designed for New Zealand, where inside the house it was almost always cool. Mary Carson, exercising gently by walking down to see her sister-in-law, looked at Fee's high-necked, floor-length calico gown superciliously. She herself was clad in the new fashion, a cream silk dress coming only halfway down her calves, with loose elbow sleeves, no waist, and a low décolletage. "Really, Fiona, you're hopelessly old-fashioned," she said, glancing round the parlour with its fresh coat of cream paint, the Persian carpets, and the spindly, priceless furniture. "I have no time to be anything else," Fee said, curtly for her when acting as hostess. "You'll have more time now with the men away so much and fewer meals to get. Raise your hems and stop wearing petticoats and stays, or you'll die when summer comes. It can get 15 to 20 degrees hotter than this, you know." Her eyes dwelled on the portrait of the beautiful blonde woman in her Empress Eugenie crinoline. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing. "My grandmother." "Oh, really? And the furniture? The carpets?" "Mine, from my grandmother." "Oh, really? My dear Fiona, you've come down in the world, haven't you?" Fee never lost her temper, so she didn't now, but her thin lips got thinner. "I don't think so, Mary. I have a good man. You ought to know that." "But penniless. What was your maiden name?" "Armstrong." "Oh, really? Not the Roderick Armstrong Armstrongs?" "He's my oldest brother. His namesake was my great-grandfather." Mary Carson rose, flapping her picture hat at the flies, which were not respecters of person. "Well, you're better born than the Clearys are, even if I do say so myself. Did you love Paddy enough to give all that up?" "My reasons for what I do," said Fee levelly, "are my business, Mary, not yours. I do not discuss my husband, even with his sister." The lines on either side of Mary Carson's nose got deeper. Her eyes bulged slightly. "Hoity-toity!" She did not come again, but Mrs. Smith, her housekeeper, came often and repeated Mary Carson's advice about their clothes. "Look," she said, "there's a sewing machine in my quarters which I never use. I'll have a couple of the rouseabouts carry it down. If I do need to use it, I'll come down here." Her eyes strayed to baby Hal, rolling on the floor gleefully. "I like to hear the sound of children, Mrs. Cleary." Once every 6 weeks the mail came by horse-drawn dray from Gillinbone. This was the only contact with the outside world. Drogheda possessed a Ford truck, another specially constructed Ford truck with a water tank on its tray, a Model T Ford car, and a Rolls-Royce limousine.
but no one ever seemed to use them to go into Gilly, save Mary Carson infrequently. 40 miles was as far as the moon. Bluey Williams had the mail contract for the district, and took 6 weeks to cover his territory. His flat-topped dray, with its 10-foot wheels, was drawn by a magnificent team of 12 draft horses, and was loaded with all the things the outlying stations ordered. As well as the Royal Mail, he carried groceries, gasoline in 44-gallon drums, kerosene in square 5-gallon cans, hay, bags of corn, calico bags of sugar and flour, wooden chests of tea, bags of potatoes, farm machinery, mail-order toys, and clothes from Anthony Horton's in Sydney, plus anything else that had to be brought in from Gilly or outside. Moving at the clipping rate of 20 miles a day, he was welcomed wherever he stopped, plied for news and weather far away, handed the scribbled scraps of paper carefully wrapped around money for goods he would purchase in Gilly, handed the laboriously written letters which went into the canvas sack marked Royal GVR Mail. West of Gilly, there were only 2 stations on the route, Drogheda closer in, Bugella farther out. Beyond Bugella lay the territory that got mail only once every 6 months. Bluey's dray swung in a great zigzagging arc through all the stations southwest, west, and northwest, then returned to Gilly before setting out eastward, a smaller journey, because Buru town took over 60 miles east. Sometimes he brought people sitting beside him on his unsheltered leather seat, visitors or hopefuls looking for work. Sometimes he took people away, visitors or discontented stockmen or maids or rouseabouts, very occasionally a governess. The squatters owned cars to transport themselves, but those who worked for the squatters depended upon Bluey for transport as well as goods and letters. After the bolts of cloth Fee had ordered came on the mail, she sat down at the donated sewing machine and began to make loose dresses in light cotton for herself and Meggie, light trousers and overalls for the men, smocks for Hal, curtains for the windows. There was no doubt it was cooler minus layers of underwear and tightly fitting outerwear. Life was lonely for Meggie, only Stuart at the house among the boys. Jack and Hughie were off with their father learning to be stockmen. Jackaroos, the young apprentices were called. Stuart wasn't company the way Jack and Hughie used to be. He lived in a world all his own, a quiet little boy who preferred to sit for hours watching the behavior of a throng of ants than climb trees, whereas Meggie adored to climb trees and thought Australian gums were marvelous, of infinite variety and difficulty. Not that there was much time for tree climbing, or ant-watching for that matter. Meggie and Stuart worked hard. They chopped and carried the wood, dug holes for refuse, tended the vegetable garden, and looked after the fowls and pigs. They also learned how to kill snakes and spiders, though they never ceased to fear them. The rainfall had been mediocrely good for several years. The creek was low, but the tanks were about half full. The grass was still fairly good, but apparently nothing to its lush times. "It will probably get worse," said Mary Carson grimly. But they were to know flood before they encountered a full-fledged drought. Halfway through January, the country caught the southern edge of the northwest monsoons. Captious in the extreme, the great winds blew to suit themselves. Sometimes only the far northern tips of the continent felt their drenching summer rains. Sometimes they traveled far down the outback and gave the unhappy urbanites of Sydney a wet summer. That January, the clouds stormed dark across the sky, torn into sodden shreds by the wind, and it began to rain. Not a gentle downpour, but a steady, roaring deluge which went on and on. They had been warned. Bluey Williams had turned up with his dray loaded high and 12 spare horses behind him, for he was moving fast to get through his rounds before the rains made further provisioning of the stations impossible. "Monsoons are coming," he said, rolling a cigarette and indicating piles of extra groceries with his whip. "The Cooper and the Barcoo and the Diamantina are running real bankers, and the overflow is overflowing. The whole Queensland outback's 2 foot under water, and them poor buggers is trying to find a rise in the ground to put the sheep on." Suddenly there was a controlled panic. Paddy and the boys worked like madmen, moving the sheep out of the low-lying paddocks and as far away from the creek and the Bar01 as they could. Father Rafe turned up, saddled his horse, and set off with Frank and the best team of dogs for 2 uncleared paddocks alongside the Bar01, while Paddy and the 2 stockmen each took a boy in other directions. Father Rafe was an excellent stockman himself.
He rode a thoroughbred chestnut mare Mary Carson had given him, clad in faultlessly tailored buff jodhpurs, shiny tan knee boots, and a spotless white shirt with its sleeves rolled up his sinewy arms and its neck open to show his smooth brown chest. In baggy old grey twill trousers, tied with baoyangs and a grey flannel undershirt, Frank felt like a poor relation. Which was what he was, he thought wryly, following the straight figure on the dainty mare through a stand of box and pine beyond the creek. He himself rode a hard-mouthed, piebald stock horse, a mean-tempered beast with a will of its own and a ferocious hatred of other horses. The dogs were yelping and cavorting in excitement, fighting and snarling among themselves, until parted with a flick from Father Rafe's viciously wielded stock-whip. It seemed there was nothing the man couldn't do. He was familiar with the coded whistles setting the dogs to work, and plied his whip much better than Frank, still learning this exotic Australian art. An 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 art.